This is Jill Kelly on September 15th at 11:45 in Chesterton, Maryland, conducting an interview for the Global Oral History of PEPFAR project. Would you go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
My name is Mark Dybul, currently a professor of medicine at Georgetown, previously one of the principal architects of and then led President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and then later the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria.
Great. Will you briefly tell us about yourself, where you grew up, your family, your education?
Grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, very blue-collar family, Italian, Polish. College was not a thing that was common. Certainly private colleges, advanced degrees. I think I'm one of only 2 people in our extended family with an advanced degree. But very strong Midwestern, early generation values, love of the country and love of work, ethics, and service, that we're on this earth to serve. Brought up in a Catholic family, very Catholic. Then went to Georgetown University undergrad, went to a Jesuit high school, Georgetown University, a Jesuit college. Worked for the president of the university, a guy named Tim Healy, larger than life. You might know him from South Africa. And then medical school at Georgetown, fellowship in infectious diseases at NIH under Tony Fauci. My first lab supervisor was Drew Weissman, who just won the Nobel Prize for RNA, inventing RNA, and we remain in touch. So I had a phenomenal experience there. But my education has been, but I studied philosophy, theology, and poetry, and as an undergrad had zero interest in science or any desire to be involved with science, and expected to get a doctorate in theology or English.
But you read an article about the pandemic in Africa?
I did. It was a cover story, and I was in college, and it just grabbed a hold of me in a way that I can't. The only way I've done this before, describe it as it's like love. Love of something you don't want to love. So I kept pushing it away and pursuing what I had intended to do, but just couldn't release the pull. So at the time, there wasn't much you could do. You could be an advocate, which I was, or you could go into health. And so I took that route.
Was there much opportunity at the university to learn more about Africa and the pandemic, or was this like your kind of personal?
It was pretty personal. I mean, Georgetown University at the time was not very involved in Africa. No one really was. And the University of Chicago, where I did my my residency, which is a phenomenal program, but even though it was on the south side of Chicago, the infectious disease department was not focused on HIV/AIDS. But the chairperson of medicine, a guy named Arthur Rubenstein, who's a legend in medicine, knew of my interest and knew that I went into medicine because of HIV. I would never have gone to medical school otherwise. And I went with no pre-med requirements because that's not what I studied. Arthur, I wanted to go to I knew I was going to do HIV. I wanted to go to Stanford because I wanted to go to California. They had accepted me, and Arthur said, no, you have to go to NIH and work with Tony Fauci. I said, I want to go back to Washington. He said, you have to meet Tony. So I flew out, met Tony, and then just went on to NIH.
So what about that meeting, or what about the mission of NIH made you want to follow that path?
NIH is the greatest university in the world, the best funded university in the world. And Tony is, in our world, now everyone knows Tony. Back then, people in our world knew Tony. And he was very much leading the national and pushing into the global response on HIV. And the mix of his scientific strength and the power of his lab. I mean, you don't get the opportunities to do the type of research I was able to do at my age, including studies that we did in Africa, being at Stanford. You don't have to get grants if you're inside NIH. You do have to be approved, but you're your bandwidth, your opportunity, and then with being with Tony, your opportunity is extraordinary.
So will you tell us a little bit about that work, particularly the work in Africa?
Well, we did a lot of different work, and I ended up running a section of his lab, virology, immunology, and we were studying a number of things: how the virus evades in the immune response, how when resistance to drugs develop, because I was very interested in how do we get treatment to Africa all along. That was my driving force. And then we began studying what drugs were most effective at fighting the virus and eliminating as much as possible the virus in the lymph nodes, which Tony's lab actually discovered. Lymph nodes is one of the key reservoirs. But that wasn't enough. We wanted to do more. And so we realized that at the current cost and the toxicity of the therapies that were available at the time, it was twice a day. It was in the, $5,000 to $15,000 a year, mostly $15,000 a year. That was kind of the standard number. And it had a lot of toxicity associated with it. It means you needed a big lab infrastructure to monitor it. We came up with an idea of giving people less, therapy than they needed, what's called intermittent therapy. And we actually proved that you could take 5 days and take 2 days off, take 5 days of drugs, 2 days off. And it's as good as taking 7 days in a row. And we also showed that by doing that, you reduce the cost by a third, and you also reduce toxicities dramatically, which we thought would then enhance the ability to treat in Africa. To demonstrate that, we wanted to do it in Africa. So we worked with the Joint Clinical Research Center in Kampala, Peter Mugenie and Sissi Kityo, to implement that study. That's now been published. Unfortunately, that hasn't been taken up because we could, even at today's costs, we could be saving people from toxicity. The drugs aren't very toxic anymore, and it's once a day, and we're moving towards once every 6 months. But that was our driving force. How do we get therapy to Africa, to as many people as possible in Africa?
And so was that your first trip to the continent, working at NIH?
Yes. The first trip was for the International AIDS Conference in 2000, which was held in Durban, South Africa, which was actually a transformational meeting.
I'd say that's a big one.
Yeah, that not many conferences are transformational. That was a transformational meeting. It really got the world to pay attention to what was happening in Africa. We were at a point in the United States and other wealthy countries where basically most people who needed therapy were getting it. But people in Africa were not. And most people were not aware of what was happening on the continent. The vast majority of people were not aware. The academics were not. So the people who normally go to those meetings really had their eyes open to what was happening, and there was a real shift in understanding that something needed to be done. In fact, after that meeting, Vice President Gore was instructed to work with Tony Fauci to come up with a plan for how the U.S. could do more in Africa. That turned into a research initiative. It was called the Blue Sky Initiative. But it was really fundamentally a research capacity infrastructure, and it was 2000, and an election was coming, and there wasn't a lot. It was July of 2000, so there wasn't a lot the administration was going to be able to do. But that was how transformative that meeting was.
So will you talk a little bit about the state of American involvement as you saw it, or American government involvement at that moment, before Gore and the Blue Sky Initiative? What was your vision of what the U.S. should be doing or could be doing?
Because of the work, our work on the treatment interruption really didn't begin until after 2000. I was at the 2000 meeting because that's what we did. And we had started in the U.S. intermittent therapy. We just hadn't started in Africa. It was actually at that meeting that we presented it and became one of the big takeaways from the meeting. Hey, this could be possible. But So it was more focused on that. How do we get current therapy out? The studies that showed the reduction of mother-to-child transmission from nevirapine, single-dose nevirapine, were not done yet. A lot of studies were not done yet because people weren't really doing a lot of work in Africa at the time.
Yeah. When did you first start to get an inkling that the American government, either in Congress or the newly elected administration, was really going to start putting some weight behind the global pandemic and fighting it?
Yeah, so in addition to running a section of Tony's lab, I was his assistant director for medical affairs, which was basically everything related to HIV. So I was the executive secretary of the guidelines panel for adolescent and adult therapy treatment in the United States. So we were always seeing the data all the time. It was a very prestigious panel, which I was fortunate to be executive secretary of. So I wasn't on the panel, I was the executive secretary. But we were looking at the data all the time and seeing what was happening, which meant, NIH is very removed from government. It's not a political arm for the most part. It is it's a university, the best medical university in the world by far. But because of my positions, I still had to know what was going on. So I knew that there was some effort in Congress, especially around prevention of mother-to-child transmission. There was the Global Fund had been on paper created. You can argue whether it was in Japan, the G7 in Japan, or the G7 in Genoa in Italy. People argue over which is which. When you're raising money, you tell the Japanese it was Osaka. When you're in Italy, you say it was Genoa. But regardless, it was on paper there, which was an idea that actually President Obasanjo of Nigeria and Kofi Annan, who was Secretary General, a Ghanaian, had. And there had been a move. Barbara Lee was very involved, Bill Frist, John Kerry, others in Congress, the Congressional Black Caucus of Congress, in trying to push resources there. But it wasn't going anywhere. There just wasn't the support or understanding of it. So I was aware of what was happening, but it was clear it wasn't really gaining enough traction. The first time I got an inkling that something bigger was happening from the administration came when they announced immediately after the Bush administration, immediately after they came into office, an international HIV task force chaired by Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, and Tommy Thompson, Secretary of Health and Human Services. NIH is in Health and Human Services, which most people in NIH probably didn't know at the time. And then, of course, the first gift to the Global Fund, which made it real. It took it from paper to existence. There were staff members, but there was no money. President Bush giving the first gift of $200 million in the Rose Garden, which Kofi Annan and President Obasanjo attended.
What did you have thoughts about the global funds and this mechanism for giving it traction at the time?
We all thought anything that existed would be great. Being in a bureaucracy, I also understood that standing up something brand new in the international world with $200 million and something that on paper had existed for 2 to 3 years and just was getting money in was going to be a challenge.
Now, you mentioned the committee that starts with the Bush administration with Powell and Thompson. This is happening before 9/11, but
as was the first gift, as was
the first
global fund gift.
Yeah. And so on the one hand, this is part of the Bush administration, separate from security, but also the U.S. had declared HIV/AIDS a national security threat. And, after the 1998 bombings in East Africa and a number of other kind of events, this was becoming part of conversations about national security, right? How are you experiencing this or thinking about this?
Yeah. Actually, it was not only the Bush administration, I mean the United States, but the United States, the first time the Security Council met on a health issue was HIV in the Clinton administration when Holbrooke was ambassador to the United Nations. Vice President Gore went for it. And the National Intelligence Council, which is kind of an intellectual arm of the CIA, had published a report saying that HIV was a global threat. They miscalculated and said that Nigeria, Russia, India, China were going to have hundreds of millions of infections. But also pointed to things that people on the continent knew. Africa was struggling to put together peacekeeping forces because so much of the military was infected. In fact, that's why President Museveni got out, because Cuba was very involved in Uganda, and Castro told Museveni, "Did you know 50% of your force military is going to die?" And Museveni was a former general, and there was that security element. I have to say, in all of the conversations, and it was there, and we certainly used it to draw in people who might not naturally support a massive humanitarian program on humanitarian grounds. We certainly used it, but we were also aware it wasn't the most powerful argument by any stretch of the imagination. But I have to say, in all of the meetings, and I've been in almost all of them, there are certainly White House meetings that Tony and I were not in, where they talked about strategy. But it never came up in any meeting I was ever in, including through the implementation of PEPFAR, with the president, with any senior member of the staff, with Josh Bolton in his many roles. It was never discussed. So it was there, and we were conscious of it, and we were conscious of the political advantage of it, to say, in terms of getting support. But it was never a driving force, and it was not the impetus for the initiative, which you can tell from the fact that they started long before 9/11.
Yes, and so there were a number of delegations to the continent with different American officials that are starting to kind of give some of the traction to these things that existed on paper. And I say it was either late 2001 or early 2002, there was the delegation with Tommy Thompson and Anthony Fauci, and they return and they tap you to serve on a committee to start to build something. Will you talk about that?
Yeah, so it was the task force. So my understanding, and I've gotten to know these people very well, is after 9/11, of course, the entire White House was focused. Josh Bolton was Deputy Chief of Staff for policy, so he was responsible for policy. And so my understanding, he called a meeting of all the senior people and said, look, some of us are going to be spending a lot of time on this, but we have to get back to the rest of our agenda. We didn't just come here to respond to 9/11. This is something we have to do. But that's not why we were elected. We came to do other things. So those of you who work on those other things need to get back to it. And that included a response to HIV, which was very much part of their thinking during the campaign. And so Josh got people back on it. That included the task force then being asked to go to Africa and come back with what can we do? What should we be doing? Because the president was all about not talking about or giving money. It was like, what should we do? How are we going to make a difference? And so Secretary Powell was very busy, as you can imagine, with many other things. So Secretary Thompson took a delegation, which included Tony, but also the head of CDC. I think there were about 20 people on. I don't remember all the people who went. I was not one of them. And it was around the same time that the early studies on a single dose of a drug called nevirapine, an antiretroviral, given to women around the time of pregnancy, either immediately before or after, little single dose before really, right before delivery, could reduce transmission from mothers to children by 50%. And already, amazingly, and it has to do with the placenta and some other things, only about 50 to 60% of women transmitted anyway. So if you could reduce that by 50%, you're now down to 25%. It's pretty amazing, a single pill. And mother-to-child transmission is a pretty easy thing to win politically. The notion of pregnant women transmitting a virus to kids who are then going to get infected and die, and the mom's going to die, and you're going to have this orphan who's HIV positive, and they're going to die. It's a very emotive thing. It's why Jesse Helms, he wouldn't deal with any of the other stuff, but he could attach to that. And so, Tommy, I'm told, and all the rest of them were holding these HIV positive kids and, crying like the babies themselves. And because the NIH, part of HHS and, part of the United States government, had just funded many of these studies, several of the studies that had just shown nevirapine, it was kind of a pretty, we need to do PMT-CT. So that wasn't my idea. I was told we want to do PMT-CT. And then Tony sent me down to work with a couple of people in Health and Human Services to put together the plan. I almost didn't go because a friend of mine, young guy, 33 years old, very good friend, had just died in an accident, and I was going to go to the funeral in Nashville, and the meeting was during the funeral, and I told Tony, I have this funeral to go to. He was like, the meeting is that day. You decide, are you going to go to the meeting or you can go to the funeral? But if you're not going to go, unfortunately, you're the best person for it, and I really I need you to do this. But if you can't go, I have to send someone else. So I decided to go because the guy was very himself involved in HIV, and I know he would have wanted me to go to the meeting. So I went down and met in Bill Steiger's office, who was the head of international programming for Secretary Thompson. At the time, he was probably 24 years old, maybe 25, maybe 24. Tara Halaska, who was the counselor to the secretary, and one or two other people, and began putting together, what that plan would look like. That was in May of 2001. Is that right?
2002.
2002, May of 2002. And by mid-June, or was it July? It was the 11th, I think. June 10th or 11th, or July. President Bush was in the Rose Garden announcing the Mother and Child Initiative. And there were a series of meetings that Tony and I went down to at the White House to explain the initiative as we developed it. And then the president decided to do it and announced it. It was pretty messy in between because USAID was not aware of it. There was a bit of intergovernmental politics, but it was announced.
All right, so I'm going to ask a question about the messiness, but first I wanted to ask a little bit about putting together the model, right? Or putting together the plan. What research, and so obviously there's the new research about nevirapine, but what else are you reading? How are you choosing countries and partners for implementation, all of that?
So for the countries, it was fairly straightforward. How do you have the biggest impact? And so this was just calculations I did. I mean, the people working on this issue from HHS were not HIV experts, and they didn't know Africa necessarily. So basically, it was pretty straightforward. Where are the countries where 2/3 of the disease is? And the 2/3 of the infections from mothers to children, and there were plenty of data about that. We had actually pretty good data on maternity wards and rates of infection in women and the transmission to children. And UNAIDS was collecting these data. And so the data were pretty widely available, so it was pretty easy to bring the calculations in. It turns out we were too heavily focused on those centers because that's a very high at-risk group. We actually, UNAIDS had to cut the estimate of the number of people in the world with HIV by 50% when we started to measure outside of maternity wards. Because women, there were districts in Botswana where 75% of pregnant women were infected. So the calculations weren't that difficult on, well, if you're going to reduce it by 50% over a 5-year period, you're already at 50, you get down to actually a full transmission rate of 25%. How many children's lives could you save? How much would that cost? And there were estimates, on the cost of the therapy. We had to kind of make up, and this became very important with antiretroviral therapy, the cost to deliver something that complicated. But because it was concentrated in the countries with 2/3 of the infection, which were all African, the Caribbean got tossed in because Tommy Thompson won the Caribbean. HHS was involved, and there was a lot. Haiti was going to be included because Haiti was one of the most impacted countries. But the Caribbean overall is complicated, and to that extent, he was right. HHS was very involved in a pan-Caribbean effort, both scientifically and in terms of healthcare delivery. CARICOM, it's had various different names, and the CDC actually had very important centers there. So Haiti was going to be involved anyway. Guyana got added for bizarre reasons. Tommy wanted Guyana added, but they did at a very high rate. And then all of the Caribbean, because people move all over the Caribbean. I mean, it's constant movement. And so if you're not dealing it regionally in the Caribbean, you couldn't really get control. So the Caribbean region was included. But the other countries are very easy. Now, everyone always reasonably asks, why wasn't, at the time, Swaziland, now Eswatini, included? And I got a lot of grief from the king and the queen mother, His Majesty, when he was very young, actually, for why. And the reason was the Global Fund had launched very few early grants. And one of the largest, hundreds of millions of dollars for a country of less than 1 million, around the time 1 million people, one of the largest grants was to Eswatini, or Swaziland at the time. Same with Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had a huge grant. Now, Zimbabwe, there are other issues, of course, probably, but the main one was just, it made no sense for us to go in and compete where the Global Fund was already moving. So we always saw the Global Fund as the multilateral partner that the U.S. was heavily invested in. President Bush not only gave the first gift, he gave the second gift to get up to $500 million, which at the time was, I think, half of the Global Fund. So we were very invested in the Global Fund. So we weren't going to go double up efforts in countries like Swaziland, Eswatini. So it was the other countries where 2/3 of the infection was.
Okay, and you mentioned those turf issues in some of the meetings in which this was being pitched to the White House. Will you talk a little bit about those?
I don't remember if Tony talks about it in his book. I was not in the blow-up meeting where it became very challenging in front of the president. I was involved in the meetings after at the technical level, which were pretty tense. But at that point, it was clear it was going to be a joint initiative between USAID and HHS. There were leads named from HHS and from AID. I was the lead for HHS. Those early meetings were pretty difficult. And to be honest, I think AID was actively trying not to implement so that Andrew Natsios, the head of AID, which did happen, could go to the president and say, this isn't working, you have to give it all to AID. It'll never work for these two agencies to work together. So I think they were intentionally actually slowing things down and trying to make it difficult.
And then there was the June Rose Garden announcement. How did that feel?
That felt great because I was like finally done. I was not named the lead for HHS at that point. That was after. I literally was like, this is great. It's being announced. Someone else has to do it, and I can go back to the job I love, which was my NIH job.
So you are feeling good and expecting to go back to the lab, and that does not happen.
No, so Tony called me from on his way to the metro. There was everyone has this vision of people in the government, including senior people like Tony, driving around. We were on the metro all the time. The red line went straight down to the K Street, just by the White House. So he was leaving the Rose Garden, walking to the metro, and he called me and said, Mark, we got to do something more. They want to do something more. The president said do something bigger. He literally said, the president, and it was actually Josh, but the president said, this is a nice start, think big. Those were the exact words. And I happened to have been recently, because of the Mother and Child Initiative and because of our work in Uganda, and had seen antiretrovirals being delivered by motor scooter to communities because people couldn't get into clinics, and it was revolutionary. People in village, I went out to these places, in completely remote, unreachable villages except by motorbikes that could get through the roads. They were delivering antiretroviral therapy. And if you go into these and talk with the families, they were talking about their CD4 cell count, their viral load. The entire family was tested. They were actively testing everyone in the village. And it was absolutely breathtaking, which I didn't think was possible. And also Peter Mugenier, because we were working with Joint Clinical Research, that was being done by TASO, a local organization in far eastern Uganda, Kericho, just on the border of Kenya. But in other areas, Joint Clinical Research Center, which is based in the capital, Kampala, Peter had started opening satellite clinics run by nurses for people who could afford antiretroviral therapy. And Peter risked arrest by bringing in generic products. Of course, President Museveni didn't do anything, but so he'd open these satellite clinics run by nurses all over. There were 5 or 6 of them that he told me about, and we went to visit 1 or 2 of them. So I'd seen these 2 models of how you actually could get therapy out. So as Tony was coming up by Metro, it was already in my head, this is exactly what we can do. So Tony came in, sat behind his desk and said, what are we gonna do? I was like, we can actually get treatment out, not just mother and child.
Can you rewind a minute for us and tell us about the relationship with JCRC? You know, were there already kind of connections between NIH and their work, or was that something?
There was, so, but through third parties, which is how, unless NIH is, there's the intramural program, which is what we're in up at the campus, or directly employed by NIH. But 80 to 90% of the money actually goes to universities, and then the universities do programs. So there were a few universities, including Cleveland, especially Cleveland, I think there was one other one, that actually was very actively involved in JCRC. Their labs look better than mine at NIH. I mean, they could do a PCR. They could do very extensive genetic work. I mean, a really phenomenal place. NIH was directly involved through Tom up in, I'm blanking on the name, more eastern, and they had their own complex, but they weren't doing antiretroviral therapy the way Peter was doing it, and the way Tasso was doing it. So through these other places, yes, NIH was involved. But Tony met Peter somewhere, and I don't remember where. And when I told Tony I wanted to take the intermittent therapy trial to Africa because we should do it there, he said, well, we've got to talk to Peter Mugenier. So that's why we met with Peter before, and then I went on the first trip there, which was during the Mother and Child Initiative. I knew the CDC, I got to know the CDC director, John O'Merman, who had started that TASO program with TASO, and his wife, Becky Bunnell, who's now the deputy, it's a very small world, who's now the principal deputy at the GHSD, which is running PEPFAR in the State Department. They were in Uganda at the time. So I got to, so NIH's relationship with JCRC was through someone else, but then Tony got to know Peter. We met with Peter. Peter explained what he was doing. It was clearly the best site, and they had the best reach to be able to do the study we were going to do, and they were hyper interested in doing it. Sissy Kityo's assistant, who now runs the, not assistant, but the program director, assistant, deputy director, now runs JCRC, was hyper interested. So it was clear that was the place to go.
Okay, so Tony's at his desk. You're telling him this is the model. You've seen it, and you.
And he responded by saying, "We can't forget prevention." He meant vaccines at the time, and of course, the Mother and Child Initiative would fold into it. But he was absolutely right. I mean, you can't. We still cannot treat our way out of this disease. We can't use PrEP. PrEP is a form of prevention. We need more than that. So we had to work on prevention so that we could reduce the numbers, because the only way it would ever be feasible financially to treat would be to bring down the number of infections. I mean, you had 38% of Botswana, Namibia, Eswatini infected. I mean, the adult population. In many countries, between 5 and 15%. I mean, that's not. You can't, there's not enough money in the world to do all that treatment if you kept that infection rate up. And then you need care too, because you needed, at the time, a lot's changed, but at the time, you need to have people in care so you would know when to begin therapy, because at the time, therapy was really for people who had fewer than what's called 200 CD, when their immune system had at least reached a certain point. So you'd ideally want them in care so you would know when to start, because if you started too much later, the likelihood that the drugs would work well goes down substantially, and they're already getting sick.
So tell me who is involved at this point, right? You are working on this through HHS. Who are you working with, and how are you starting to put this down on paper?
So this was, I guess it was July. I can't remember because I can't remember when the Barcelona AIDS meeting was. I know it was in
July
2002. Yeah. So the announcement was June then. So Tony, he has a remarkable instinct for political moments and when to do things. So he's like, this is exactly what we need to do. I will find the right moment to raise it with them. So he was down there a bunch for other things, mostly BioShield and other issues, which was a biosecurity issue. So he would see the same people, which are Gary Edson at National Security Council, Jay Lefkowitz at the Domestic Policy Council, because this stuff crosses domestic and international, who are director levels. He would occasionally run into Josh. So one time when he was down there, which happened to be about 2 weeks after a week after the Barcelona meeting, he was down there. So I just got back from Barcelona. Mark and I think that this is the big thing. This is what we could do. They loved it. So he called me. I was at a little inn where there were no telephones or anything in Spain. I remember we were sitting at the pool. It's an old convent in this remote village that they converted into a nice little getaway, which I kind of needed at the time. And the owner of the place comes and finds me. He's like, "There's a guy on this phone for you. His name's Tony." I was like, "What?"
Interrupting your vacation.
Yeah. So I had to go to the office, pick up the phone. He's like, Mark, they love it. They love it. We got to get him something right away. So on the way back, I basically wrote out, because I'm not very technologically, and we couldn't take laptops home at the time. We barely had laptops. I wrote out in longhand pretty much what became the basis of the plan, which then when I got back, I typed out. And then there was a meeting chaired by Margaret Spelling, who is the head of the Domestic Policy Council, with Gary, Jay, Robin Cleveland from the Office of Management and Budget, Kristen Silverberg, who was Josh's deputy, who was assigned to manage this for him, who was hugely important. And then some of the ledge people, a few other people. It was, Margaret's office, even though she doesn't have the Domestic Policy Council, is a beautiful corner, in about the size of this room, all wood paneled, until Ivanka got there and she gutted it and turned it into an austere white thing. So first time I went in with Ivanka, I was like, wait a minute, was this Margaret's office? Because it looks so different. But anyway, so that meeting happened where we presented the plan. And if you go back and read that plan, it's like 90% of what was announced as the State of the Union. So that first plan, actually, we did iterations and we built on things, but pretty much what was in that plan, with the exception of getting India, Russia, and China out, because we were based on the NIC report, I had included India, Russia, and China, despite the politics of it, which we never thought would be included, but I kind of felt obligated as a scientist to go where the so-called data were telling us to go. The meeting went quite well. There were a few tense moments, especially with Robin, including saying, why we focus on HIV, malaria kills many more people, why don't we focus on malaria? She used to work for Mitch McConnell on the Senate committee, Appropriations Committee, that dedicated money to development, so she knew it inside and out. And she was the top person in the Office of Management and Budget, the PAD, the Policy Associate Director. We called him the Political Associate Director, but the PAD. And that's her job, to ask questions like that. But she also knew it, and she knew the numbers, and she knew things. And Mitch was very dedicated to development because his dad, he had polio because his dad was a missionary in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia. So she was also focused on Southeast Asia. She was like, why aren't we more focused on things that are broader? Asia's the future for the United States, not just Africa. So she raised very reasonable questions. I think she got a little aggressive at one point. Who the hell are the two of you to bring up? Very Robin. But overall, the meeting went really well. Mike Gerson was in that meeting as well. So Gary Edson and Jay Lefkowitz grabbed Tony and me after the meeting, took us down to the Situation Room, which back then was literally like a nothing conference room. We're like, I can't believe this is the Situation Room. It was also smaller than Margaret's office. And we talked through a little bit how to proceed from there. And Gary said, these are the things I need you to give us. Jay jumped in a bunch too. And then he said, we need to just move. He also said, leave Robin to me. I'll work with her, because they were very close and working on a lot of stuff together. That led to months of back and forth, different versions, iterations with they would bring questions to us and ask for memos based on those questions, revisions. We had several meetings in Robin's office because they wanted to make, appropriately, it was a smart political move, do it in her office because it's going to be the most difficult. She and I had several shouting matches, which was always fun. But, again, that's her job. And it was important. But I remember the first time we came in with the first plan, she literally threw it at me. And she's like, this is a work of PR. There's nothing in here. This is a communications thing. This is not a plan. And she had a point, because no one had ever done this. There were painfully few data. So we did heavy groundwork by going back to Joint Clinical Research Center, by going back to Tasso. They didn't know why. I told them we were doing it because Tony and I were interested in expanding what we were already working on and doing more on how to deliver therapy. So I got budget numbers. I was like, how much does it cost to run one of those clinics that Peter had set up with that nurse that ran? What was the infrastructure cost? What are your running costs? What are the antiretroviral costs? For each of those clinics, and how much does it cost you back home to run the tests and all those things. Did the same thing with John O'Merman at Tasso, got all his numbers. And then based on that, going country by country, and county by county and state by state, or however they organize themselves, did what became known as the network model, which is, sometimes people in White House are like it was a genius new idea. It's how every health system in the world, including ours, runs. But it's a spoken wheel, right? There's a central high-level facility, and then you go out further and further down to the villages. So we could, because of those numbers, working with Ralph Tate, who was the CFO for NIID, because I'm not good with Excel. He put everything to Excel. We went country by country. We didn't do all 14 and all of the Caribbean, but we did 8 or 9 countries, full on. What would it cost to deliver? Bottom up. Because that's what the president asked for. He was like, don't come back and tell me how much you need and ask me to write a check. Come back and tell me what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and then I'll find the money. Leave that part to me. Because the way we'd done development before was all, you need X amount of money. If you asked anyone before the Bush administration what you're doing in agriculture, education, health, anything, the answer would be, we're spending X millions of dollars. What are you getting for that? Oh, that's too complicated. So there were no one had goals, no one had objectives, no one had numbers. The numbers we had were made up. USAID would have $40,000 in the country, and they'd claim that they averted every child's death in that country, and just ridiculous stuff. Because there were no metrics, no one followed anything, there weren't data. And when we were told we're going to set goals and have objectives, people, that's too complicated. Development's too complicated. You can't do that. It's ridiculous. But anyway, so we had the bottom-up numbers, and we went country by country, and Ralph and I would spend too much time because he got in trouble by the deputy director, John LaMontagne, who happened bizarrely to be Margaret Spelling's brother-in-law, even though Margaret was going through a divorce at the time, but was very close with him, which became important later. He got ticked off at me and called me and was like, "What are you doing spending all this time with Ralph on?" Because no one knew what we were doing. You know, what do you spend all this time with Ralph on? He's actually got a job as CFO. He's like, "Well, you talk to Tony." It's not my fault. So Ralph was really important because he ran those numbers. Now the prevention side was a little more complicated because we didn't have I didn't have someone to call to get down to the facility level, and then the facility level up. What does that look like numerically that we could run? But there was a paper published by John Stover in the Lancet, Bernard Schwartlander and John Stover, UNAIDS. John was a academic guy, or actually he was with an NGO, I don't remember at the time. But they had just published a paper in Lancet on how you could reduce infections by 60% with these key interventions. They didn't list by country. They just listed the overall program on how you could do it. So I called John, and again, I had to lie to him on why I was calling him. I was like, Tony and I are thinking of doing something on prevention, looking at some countries. Could you send me the country by country numbers? Because they had them, they just weren't published. And John was like, I'm not sure. I was like, it'd be really helpful. No one else will ever see them, which is true. I just need to see them. So he sent me them. So based on that, I could just take the numbers that he had for the 14 countries. We had to, we didn't really do anything on the Caribbean, and that's how we got to the goal. So the treatment goal was based on, and the cost. They also had costed what it would cost for those interventions. So we basically took their packages and put them in. The care costs were based on the numbers we got from Peter and from Jono. The treatment costs were based on what we got from John. And then we made assumptions, big assumptions, and just set goals similar to PMTCT. So again, using the UNAIDS numbers, which were twice as many, as we said, number of infected people in each country, with the assumption that you wouldn't treat until you got to 200,000. If you wanted to reach 50% of the people who need CD4 cell count of 200, with the assumption, like PMTCT, that you were going to reach 50% of those in need of antiretroviral therapy within 5 years, because it takes time, which we knew from Botswana and other places. How many people would that be? And then how many people would you need in care in order to find those people at the right moment? And then just model all that out. And then we also had to take big swings on, because people really didn't know the infrastructure costs, the health systems costs, logistics systems, supply systems. Peter was doing that, TASA was doing that based on their own, no one knew what those costs would be. So I just made a wholesale assumption based on a World Bank report, that it was $1,500 per year per person. That was just the antiretroviral cost. They hadn't built anything either. We were going to use the generic price, which is $300. That's a delta of $1,200. Looking at the numbers that we had from Peter and from John Stover and from John, I was like, let's just assume the infrastructure cost is, $1,200, and that gives us a cost of $1,500 per person. And so it was a bottom up, but it was a big assumption. There were a lot of us, because no one had ever done it before. I mean, no one knew it was possible. Most people said it was impossible. People forget there was not a Millennium Development Goal for antiretroviral therapy. And the reason was the preponderance of the public health community in 2001, 2002, 2003, going into 2004, thought it was impossible to deliver antiretroviral therapy in Africa. Daily therapy, at the time, twice daily therapy, to remote areas. People literally stood on the floor of the General Assembly, UN General Assembly, as the Millennium Development Goals were being debated, saying people in Africa were too poor, too uneducated, they didn't have the systems, it would be a waste of money to invest in treatment, the best we can do is prevention. In fact, the first head of the Global Fund said that. couple months before he got elected as the first head of the Global Fund. So the vast majority of the public health community thought it was wrong to try to do antiretroviral therapy in Africa. And hidden beneath that, not barely hidden, were two really appalling things. One, outright racism. I mean, just assumptions that an entire continent was incapable of doing something when they were just as smart and talented, if not more, than we are, and came up with solutions we could never come up with in the United States that we then brought back and applied to the United States. But also beneath it was this equally appalling, which kept coming back and almost derailed everything 2 years later through the World Bank, that, well, if we treat these people and they really don't know how to do it and can't do it, they're not going to take it regularly, so you're going to get resistance, and that resistance is going to come back and hurt our own people. So let's not treat them because they're going to cause resistance that will hurt us. Just really horrible, horrible thing that viscerally upset the president when people would raise stuff like this. He would just get, he's very calm, he can put up with just about anything, but the notion that, you know, you would just dismiss an entire continent of talented people just because you don't think they can do it, you just get so angry.
Yeah. And in theory, these are public health people who have been on the ground and yet still have...
They're not bad people. There's a former prime minister, I'm blanking on which one, who I used to quote all the time. If history's taught us anything, it's never trust the experts. Because you always come up with 1,000 reasons there are 1,000 good reasons not to do almost anything innovative. You have to find the reasons to do it. And that's what President Bush was brilliant at, finding the reasons, and Josh and the team around him, finding the reasons to do something. Understanding what the challenges are. But scientists and academicians and public health people, you know, you get so absorbed in the why something can't be done, which is why we are so bad at innovating in health care and in health treatment, because we make incremental progress because everyone thinks big ideas aren't possible. You get stuck in this kind of mode of creativity. You get stuck in your past and you're like, well, that didn't work, so this isn't going to work, and this didn't work, and that didn't work. So rather than saying, well, but this is brand new, and if we did it in this new way, it could actually work. And that's true for scientific invention. I mean, ask Drew Weissman. No one would fund RNA research. He had to actually, you know, basically pull money from other grants. And otherwise we wouldn't have the COVID vaccine. So big leaps, whether it's in science itself, scientific ideas, and it's not just in health, it's in anything. Think of Einstein. I think every great scientist has been beaten up during their lifetime, right? Great innovations, the experts will always tell you can't be done.
Okay, so you talked about having this great model from the JCRC and calling up Stover about the prevention part.
And Tasso, everyone focuses on JCRC appropriately. Peter Mugenier was at the State of the Union. Great guy, we learned a lot there. But Tasso was as, if not more important, because they were delivering antiretrovirals to villages by motor scooter. It was the most breathtaking thing to see. And one of the pictures the president saw in a very small slide deck of, I think, 5 slides, was a picture of those motor scooters delivering antivirals. It's a very powerful thing. But also from a public health perspective, it's incredibly powerful because it's very difficult for people to get to clinics. Think about what it took. If you actually took that motor scooter out, there was no way people could not go to their farms for 1 or 2 or 3 days, to walk all the way to a clinic, to sit there until they could get served, and then walk back. And at the time, you had to go monthly. It wasn't every 6 months like we are. It was every month. It just wasn't possible. So without Tasso, which was a community-based organization, without Jono and CDC seeing that opportunity, Peter wouldn't have been enough. So I always try to remind people that it wasn't just one, it was both.
I appreciate that, thanks.
And it was them, it wasn't us. We were just taking what they were doing and amalgamating.
Well, so will you talk a little bit then about the prevention part of that, that you're going off of Stover's research and publication and numbers. Did you have any idea that the nature of prevention would become as controversial as it would? So what was, tell us in your own understanding, what was Stover's call for prevention? And
so they had a list of activities, all of which were included in what became known as ABC. So they had reduction of partners, delay of sexual debut, through behavioral education, condoms, and a few other. Mother-child transmission was on the list. We ultimately put mother and child transmission in treatment because of the earmark, so that we could decrease the denominator. So there were a list of 5 or 6 interventions, but including ABC, it just wasn't called ABC. But the data were pretty overwhelming, and if you actually look at the data, and this is published by Imperial College, based in Zimbabwe. The number one way to reduce new infections was delay sexual debut by a year. That's what absence was never don't ever have sex. I mean, who the hell would ever? It was delay by a year. And that one delay, because of if you infect 2 people in that year, the multiplier effect over the lifetime is enormous. So if you just delay by a year and a half, that's what drove the massive reduction in new infections in Zimbabwe. It wasn't death. They accounted for death. It was delay in sexual debut. And then the B part was being faithful was, and this is something that is also one of these disgusting myths that, just got promulgated, and I think is a reason in Becky. And it also just appalled President Bush and Condi and everyone else too. But there was this thing that got circulated that African men were promiscuous animals, basically, and had sex with thousands of people all the time, and there's no way you were going to stop that. Just disgusting, racist garbage. The reality is African men have fewer lifetime sexual partners than American men. But they had multiple concurrent partnerships because they were minors. And this is another thing about HIV most people don't understand. It was not the poorest of the poor who were most at risk. It was people who had jobs, who were socially mobile, who could go to clubs and drink. And so that's not to say poor people weren't at risk, but the most at healthcare workers, teachers, 50-60% infection rates in some of these countries, and teachers and healthcare workers and factory workers. And Ford Motor Company was one of the first to start antiretroviral therapy in Anglo-American in South Africa because all their workers were dying. And it was pretty difficult to replace them. So they trained these people and they'd all die. So it was people that had a little bit of money who were dying. So if you're working in a mine or if you're working in a factory, you generally have your home or your homestead in a village. Every president, every minister, they still go home to their home village virtually every weekend. So people had multiple concurrent partnerships because they were in different places for very significant periods of time. And that dynamic leads to very high infection rates because if that man is infected, he's now infecting 2 women. And those women, when the man is there, have other lives. And so it was the 2 biggest impacts on reducing infection from a behavioral perspective were delaying sexual debut, reducing multiple concurrent partners, or being faithful, and then use condoms. If you're not going to do A or B, use a condom. Or even if you are doing A or B, use a condom because you're not sure what your partner's been doing. So it wasn't a nonsense thing. It actually originated in Uganda. It did not originate with a bunch of evangelicals from the United States that people love to run around and say. It originated in a very common sense, culturally sensitive approach that responded to the cultural reality on the ground. And even the Catholic Archbishop of Durban was like, of course, C, yes, I'd prefer you to do the A or B, but if you're not, I'd rather you do C than D, which is die. So use a condom. So I was not conscious. I didn't grasp at all what the dynamics were any more than I grasped what the intergovernmental politics would be. I mean, I've seen that at an age, but I had no idea. I mean, I only half jokingly say now, probably not joking at all, that if I knew then what I know now about how the US government works, how our international systems work, how countries work, I never thought PEPFAR was possible either. I would have been in with the rest of the health public health officials saying, no, this is never going to work.
And then I would say, and notably, vaccines were not part of this discussion, right?
Honestly, Tony wanted them to be.
Okay.
And I remember this was part of the discussion at his desk the day he came back from the Rose Garden and the Mother and Child Initiative. When he said prevention, he meant investment in vaccines. And he was very explicit about that. And you go back and look at the Blue Sky Plan, that's all it was. It was investment in research and capacity building so that you could get to a vaccine. And that's been his holy grail for a long time. It's like, Tony, two things. First of all, they expect us to come, we're NIH, they expect us to come back with a plan that has a big research component. If we have $1 for research in this plan, they're not going to take it seriously. And secondly, we're not going to have a vaccine. So there's a pocket of money that should go to vaccines, but let's keep this just focused on health interventions. And Tony is a very smart guy, but also a very caring guy. And he got in a second, he was like, you're absolutely right. We'll leave vaccines out and for something else. This has to be about care and treatment, prevention, care and treatment.
And what were the bigger conversations? What were the expectations as you guys were working? You mentioned earlier the kind of cost of drugs, and you were running with the generic drug costs. What was happening in Congress? What was happening, in the minds of the Bush administration about where generic drugs would fit in?
Yeah, this has become, absurdly controversial. Because people love coming up with conspiracy theories and crazy stuff. The State of the Union address, I didn't understand this at the time. The State of the Union address, it's funny when someone calls me in January, it's like, oh, we gotta get something in the State of the Union address. That was written 3 months ago. I mean, what are you talking about? Every word in that address is interrogated, gone over, edited 1,000 times, every word. And this section, the HIV section, had particular focus because he was launching this huge new international initiative. He uses $300 in the speech. That was talked about. Doesn't get in there by accident. That was a generic cost number. It was very clear from the State of the Union, which was the launch of the initiative, and from all the modeling that we did, that we fully intended always to use generic drugs. How we got there and when we got there and what we required to get there was still to be worked out, but there was no question that it was going to be the generic price, ever. And we can talk more about what happened and why, but there was no question. It was in the State of the Union address.
Okay. So we will come back to that when we start talking about Congress. So you've put together this plan, drafted on the airplane on the way back from Spain.
Oh, there were so many iterations, and then it turned into a black book, which I think there were 8 copies of. And we were told not to put confidential on it because they were like, the one thing that makes anyone look at something is something that says confidential on, whereas if it's just a black binder, no one's going to care. They'll think it's a scheduling book. But they only wanted 8 copies. They wanted them numbered. They wanted them watermarked. And there was a meeting in Josh Bolton's office. I think it was October of, it was a beautiful sunny day, October of 2022, which gives you a sense of how quickly this is moving, right? May 2022, we're told, to work on something, a mother-child transition. June, it's announced, $500 million. And in between there, a year earlier, they've done $200 million for the Global Fund. That day, we're told it has to be bigger, and by January, it's in the State of the Union address. For anyone who knows anything about government.
That's incredible.
But, yeah. So why did it happen that quickly? Because the president insisted it be held incredibly tightly, which is why there were only 8 copies of the book, because there were pretty much only 8 or 9 people who had any idea this was coming. And the reason for that was the interagency process, as it's called, is very good for routine things, but it's not good for big things. If we went through the interagency process, which I now know, and the president knew, and Josh definitely knew, I mean, they were all in HW's administration. They knew how government worked. We'd still be talking about what PEPFAR should look like. And that's why Congress didn't know about it, and they were furious about it. That's why the countries didn't know about it, which was the worst part, which they were furious about, because it had to be held that tightly, or the State of the Union address, it would have been, we would not have, and it would have been the lowest common denominator. It wouldn't have been a big, bold prevention, caring, treatment program. It would have been little pilot projects and doing little, it would not have been big. So it had to be held tightly. So there's a meeting in Josh's office with what became known as the Black Book, of which we were told to do 8 copies, and I was up till 9 o'clock, like 1 in the morning, collating them myself, because there were things that we didn't have collators, and putting them in, binders and sections. And we, in that meeting, I think I remember everyone, were Josh, of course, running it, Joel Kaplan, one of his deputies, Kristen Silverberg, the deputy who was point on this, Gary Edson, Jay Lefkowitz, Margaret Spelling, Robin Cleveland, Terrell Halaska. They allowed Terrell to come, who was from HHS. But it was made clear that this was not to be discussed at HHS with anyone but the secretary. Gary was told he could tell Condi at that point, but my guess is Condi already knew about it. But and it was at that meeting that Josh said, "I think we have what we need to take it to the president." Oh, and Carol Thompson was there too. Carol was Josh's assistant, but very interested in the area. She ultimately became head of the Office of National AIDS Policy. She was walking out. She just brought the book and sat us all down. And Tony, of course. She was walking out, and Josh was like, "Carol, would you like to stay?" So she stayed. So those are the people who were in that. I'm almost positive that was everyone who was in that room. Gerson was not in that room yet. And Josh, at that point, said, "I think we have everything we need to take it to the president." They did not tell us that that meeting was a call not long after, where they said, before we do this, we want to bring some outside experts in. We're not going to tell them what the plan is, because that would blow up the keeping it secret, but we want to get a better sense of what this should look like. And I know kind of what led to that, because Margaret Spelling's brother-in-law was John LaMontagne. Even though she was getting divorced, they stayed close to her husband, who was John's brother. Margaret ran into John at a supermarket, and Margaret asked John, "Can we trust Fauci and Dybul? Do they know what they're doing?" And John said, "Yeah, of course you can, of course you can." So he told me the next day, he was like, what was she talking about? What was she asking me? I was like, I don't talk to Tony. But they also asked us to pick the experts. We would not be in the room, to pick the experts and not tell them what the meeting was about. So Tony and I went back and forth. He had some names, I had some names. It was Eric Gooseby, who later became Paul Farmer, Jean Pop, both from Haiti. Peter Mugenier, of course. And then Robin brought in Nils Dallaire, because she had been working with, he was at AID at the time. And she'd worked with him so much both at the Hill and also in the cabinet, that she brought him in without anyone knowing at the end. But Tony and I, of course, had dinner with him the night before and told him everything that was happening. And explained the plan, explained how the questioning was likely to go, what, things to stay away from, things to focus on. But we didn't give them the book, but we kind of went through, in a little Italian restaurant Tony loved in Bethesda, we kind of went through everything so that they were prepared. They acted like, they didn't know what was happening. But but Robin and Gary and Jay and Josh sat in for the whole thing, didn't say much because Josh's tendency, just listen. But they interrogated them. Nils wrote a 20-page memo after Robin that we were sent to comment on. But that meeting helped enormously because they heard from people in the field that this was possible, that this could be done.
In any of these kind of back and forth meetings with the White House, was there any kind of anticipation of what might be a conservative backlash about kind of not being greater involved, or
No, but Tony and those meetings were almost certainly happening, but not with Tony and me. That was an internal political thing. In fact, whenever we would start to raise politics, or like I remember at the meeting with Josh, I was like, because I was presenting the plan. Tony started every meeting with a high level, but then I went into the detail. I mentioned this would be a great legacy for the president, and Josh stopped and he was like, I think we'll be able to manage the president's legacy. So why don't you stick to the technical stuff? So they were definitely having those conversations. Jay was charged with dealing with a lot of it. He's an Orthodox Jew who's very well respected in conservative circles. So he was the lead on that. So they anticipate all this. It's one of the reasons the Domestic Policy Council was the lead, not the National Security Council, because they knew that the domestic politics were going to be pretty strong. So Carl wasn't in the picture at the time. It was really Jay's charge to manage that part. But they certainly knew it was coming. There was a lot of back and forth on condoms and ABC and how we do this or why not. There was a lot of back and forth on a lot of stuff. We were asked multiple times on different things, to do memos on, and I learned very quickly how to do these, which helped me in the future. You always have three options. The one you think is the right option, the middle, ridiculously expensive and big option, and a ridiculously small option. So, but we were asked to do memos on multiple things. How would you scale this back? What would you do if you had less? If you had to reduce it, what would that look like? I think it was called the Cadillac, the Chevy, or whatever versions. We were asked, why not put this on in the Global Fund? We were asked to come up with a structural model. I actually studied the Indian Healthcare Service, called the admiral who was in charge of the Indian Healthcare Service, to understand how they did. And that actually went into the models too, because in the Indian Healthcare Service, which was our vision for the long term, it's a tribal system. It's a separate country. It's a separate nation. For 50, 70 years ago, people like me, public health service people, ran all of the Indian Healthcare Service, but over time it transitioned to entirely run by the tribal system. There's a treaty, and we just audit them. That was but they also only have one hospital in Anchorage, and they have to get people from all the islands, and assess them. It's all done by community healthcare workers, so like Peter was doing. So there's a lot of things we did. We studied the central command, because one of the questions was, how would you structure this to keep all the US government going? Because we knew we needed CDC, at least, AID, NIH not really, because we were keeping the research piece out of it for the reason we talked about. AID, DOD was going to be critically important because the militaries were so heavily infected, and they were very involved in the beginning. I had a bunch of meetings over at DOD, got screamed at by 4-star generals, including, it was Jim Jones, who was head of AFRICOM at the time. And the Assistant Secretary for Health, Bill Winkenwerner, was fantastic. Then at Peace Corps, because they're actually in villages, those were the central ones. At the time, the Department of Labor actually had an HIV program, which was ridiculous. So I cut it off as soon as I got there. They were furious. And then there were a few others. But there, how are you going to get the whole government to work together? So we studied the Central Command. So we had a bunch of side things, where they would interrogate questions. Russia, China, India was pretty quickly why, and quickly cut out. So there were there was a lot of back and forth, but a lot of it was also the detail. Robin's throwing the first edition saying, this is a communications piece, not an analytic, we're the Office of Management and Budget, go talk to communications.
While you're doing this, Are you so in this that this is your sole focus, or were you paying attention to, across 2002, there was a lot of action, by kind of high profile folks like Bono, but there was also like the evangelical Christians who were holding all kinds of conferences and trying, kind of changing how people thought about HIV. Were you paying attention to any of those things that are happening?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Washington's not that. People knew something was happening. So Bono, and his people contacted Tony. A group of advocates came up and met with Tony and me. Things were kind of filtering, which were making people very anxious. At one point, the White House told us that it was dead because people were talking about it too much. Which is kind of amusing because they told me later, they were like, yeah, it was never dead. We just told you that because people were talking too much. So yeah, we were very conscious of those things. Our head was also, but we also had our regular job. I mean, Tony had a big job. I had a lot of other jobs, including trying to run the study and plus managing the PMTCT initiative, which was still moving. So we had other jobs, but yes, very, very aware of that. And the evangelical piece, very aware of, and I started talking with some of them because I was not because of an initiative, but because I was, working in Uganda already, which had a high evangelical presence. Janet Museveni, the first lady, very out front on these things. So yeah, conscious of, but that wasn't the focus. That was for the people in the White House to worry about.
And so during this work, you start to get a sense that, or you start to suspect that it'll be announced at the State of the Union address.
Until we were told it wasn't.
Yes. What did you think the reaction would be? And what did how did you feel when it was announced?
So the first time I knew it was going to be in the State of the Union was Tara Alaska called me a week before, and she was like, something's going on. Because they just asked me to organize a group of HIV people for the Indian Treaty Room the day after the State of the Union address, or the Friday after the State of the Union, I can't remember. And we were both like, that can only mean one thing. I mean, why would they pull people together? So it has to be in the State of the Union. So I went in to see Tony. I was like, Tony, I think it's going to be in the State of the Union address. And he said, there's no way it's going to be in the State of the Union address. They would have told me. I was like, okay, but they're asking for this meeting, and so I think something's going to happen. Then, State of the Union address is on Tuesday or Monday. I forget. Monday, Tuesday. I can't remember. Whatever the day. On like Friday, Gary or Jay, I don't remember who, called Tony and said, "Can you get Peter Mujanye here for the State of the Union address?" They still hadn't told us it was going to be in the State of the Union address. All right, they said, "Can you get Peter here next week?" What's happening next week? So we arranged to get Peter there. Then it was the morning of, or the night before, I don't remember which, they asked Tony to come down, in the morning, and the State of the Union address is in the evening. And they started going through the section on HIV. I was at Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation for a meeting that day, and I kept getting calls from Tony. He's like, Mom, can we say that? This is what it says. Can we say that? I was like, no, you can't say that. That's not accurate. So they actually had to change these things that have been working on for a long time. We talked about the generic drug price, and we talked about the percent of people infected, and it was the way it was written wasn't accurate. We talked about a couple other things. Like these are, so they did make some changes at the end. But they were calling and asking me, so and Tony was there working with them, line by line, with Mike Gerson and Jay and Gary. And then the day after the State of the Union address, there was another press availability with Peter Mujanye this time. So I watched it from home, as did Tony. Peter was there. And I couldn't tell anyone. So my husband was away at a meeting, so I called him and was like, watch the State of the Union address tonight. He was like, why? I was like, well, just watch it. Just watch it. So I was at home alone watching it. And I remember it very distinctly. I had this sense of elation that actually real and in the State of the Union address, the most important policy address the president gives. And also a sense of, holy shit, now someone has to do this. And I really did mean someone, because I knew the reality that could this be done? Who knows? I mean, no one had ever done it. There was a plan, but that to reality. So I had this sense of, oh my God, now someone's going to have to do this, and it's not going to, it could just fall apart. And so I had that dual sense, but I really thought I wasn't going to have to be one of them. I saw the MTCT stuff. I was like, this is going to have to be for someone much more senior, much more engaged than me to do. So similar to the MTCT initiative, I was like, I do not feel, I feel bad for the person who's going to have to, people are going to have to actually make this happen.
And even before people have to make it happen, it had to be funded.
First authorized, then funded.
Yes, authorized and funded. Will you talk about those processes?
So Tony and I were not really involved in the authorization process, a little bit more in the appropriations, and definitely a lot after the appropriations. Well, I was, Tony wasn't. The White House really managed the authorization. Their original, I have seen, the original bill they proposed to the Hill was like 7 pages. It was very simple. It was basically based on what we had. Here are the goals. This is and Congress was like, you didn't tell us about this. They found out the morning of. I mean, everyone pretends like everyone knew about it. And the number of people who claim they were involved in the process just cracks me up, which is fine, because then they all own it too. But, almost no one knew about it till the morning. The cabinet doesn't know about it. Congress did not. But, of course, they prepped the key people, and only a couple did. And then the copy of the speech came out, so then people knew it, but just before the address. The countries found out the morning of, which when we were talking about country ownership and national scale up, and it's going to be your program, is hard for them to accept when they find out, because there's a fact sheet that goes with the address. There's a fact sheet that lists the countries, lists their goals, lists their, that's not a, that's not a very country-owned approach. So they were angry.
So when you say country-owned approach, will you say, are you talking about like the teams that'll come, like the CDC, USAID teams?
No, we mean the country. Because we had that vision similar to the Indian Health Service that this was, of course, it's an there's a reason the word is emergency. There's an emergency that has to be managed, but we have to build the system so that it will transition to the countries. And because you needed to achieve the goals, you needed national scale up, which no one had ever done. Everyone had done pilot projects, which you can run out of, Rakai, that's the name of the other place. NIH, ran a great program in Rakai through a small group. It was Hopkins and a guy who straddled between Hopkins and NIH. You can run those types of things, but you can't do a national scale out, which we'd begun trying to do in MTCT, but USAID was basically blocking everything we tried to do. But national scale up you can't do without actual country ownership and building the systems. I mean, you have to, this is why public health people said it wasn't possible. You have to build the systems that are needed, especially, and prevention is the same. Prevention for HIV and care is lifelong, just like treatment, because people are at risk in different seasons, their whole life for HIV. And so you need long chronic prevention programs, and then you need chronic treatment and care programs, and you need to have systems that will deliver antiretrovirals to the most remote areas where the roads wash out during rainy season. And it's a really complicated thing so it had to be national ownership, because you can do bednet campaigns, you can do vaccine campaigns, you can do all that without necessarily a nationally owned system. You cannot do chronic care and delivery. And that's one of the great legacies of PEPFAR, the systems that were built from management to logistics, supply chain, to communications, to delivery, to healthcare workers, all of that, to epidemiologists, all of that. And that's where that $1,200 came in. That was just a let's just assume. But so I understood why the countries were angry. They had the right to be, and it took us 2 years to get over it. It took us 2 years to get over that. We also didn't anticipate I certainly didn't anticipate the congressional reaction. I stupidly was like, well, there's a Republican president, Republican controlled House and Senate. He's got a lot of political clout right now because of where the country was after 9/11. And why wouldn't every person in the U.S. government and every implementer want to do something this transformational that could save so many lives? And I didn't quite take into account how agencies and people actually function.
And this was also ahead of a national election in which one of the Democratic candidates had been involved in the initial bill as Kerry was running. And he and Frist had the kind of bipartisan legislation that they had put together, and it went nowhere. So will you tell us a little bit more about congressional reaction?
Well, there was actually very strong support in Congress in general. And they were doing pretty well getting legislation passed that they wanted. And Congress doesn't move any more quickly either. I mean, it was end of January, at the State of the Union occurs. The authorization was signed in May. But the president was really annoyed in March that they hadn't already signed it. So he called all the leaders to the East Room and all the people who were involved who were trying to block or put various pieces in around condoms or not condoms, or there's a movement by some in the faith community not to include condoms and to have earmarks for a whole bunch of stuff, and the administration was not in favor of any of that. And so there were side meetings with the people who were not blocking it, but there's basically a big meeting where he's like, what are you people doing? People are dying every day you're delaying. And so the White House put everything they had into it, which was a lot. And Congress lined up, and the key people, Senators Frist and Daschle in the Senate, Lugar and Biden and Foreign Relations, which is the authorizing committee. Biden's honest and says, look, Nancy told me I had to do it. But Lugar really wanted to do it. And then the House, you had Senator Helms and Lantos. And Helms is very Catholic. When I was worked at Georgetown University, he went to Georgetown. He would come up pretty regularly to meet with the president. So I actually met him quite a number of times. And Tom Lantos was a huge supporter. And then there was an Africa subcommittee with Chris Smith and New Jersey African-American Democrat who'd been on the CBC pushing forever. You had people like Betty McCollum and Barbara Lee, who are the only two Democrats who showed up to the signing of the bill. So there were people moving, but there were also, a lot of people in the community were furious that a Republican announced it, so they were fighting it. There were a lot of politics around different policies. And then in the House committee meeting, what became the most controversial pieces were amendments to the bill and passed on party lines. Half the Republicans in the Senate thought they were a bad idea, there were amendment after amendment after amendment, but Lugar and Frist stood there and knocked them all down until 2 a.m. Because they knew if this bill went to conference, it would die. Plus, the president really wanted to take it to the G7, 8, I think it was still 8 at the time, to say, look, we're doing 15, it really would cost 45 to get all the way. We'll do a third, why don't you do the other 2/3? Of course, they didn't do it. But he wanted to be able to take it as a signed bill, as an approved bill. So the White House and the president went all out. Tommy Thompson was on the floor of the Senate till 2 a.m. I mean, people were there and really pushing. But there was a lot of controversy around the earmarks and the things that got added into the House bill. And then it had to go back to the House, as it was, otherwise we were going to go to conference. So that's why we ended up where we ended up. But I was not involved. You have to talk with Gary, Jay especially, Josh. Josh was the director of legislative affairs under H.W. for the White House. So he knew, I mean, he was the master of, he was the angel of PEPFAR. It was President Bush all the way. Anyone who ever says it was anyone but President Bush doesn't know what they're talking about. But, you know, he needed people to do it for him, and Josh was the kind of angel, both as Deputy Chief of Staff, Director of Office Management and Budget, and then Chief of Staff.
Will you talk a little bit about the decision to locate it in state and structure it the way that it was structured, you know, so that USAID, CDC, DoD would all work together?
Yeah, so that goes back to studying the Hatch, I think it was Hatch law on the Central Command. So before the Central Command law in the 60s, literally during the World War I to the Korean War, within the same theater of action, you would have the Marines, the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy acting as independent agencies with no central command. That's why it has the name Central Command. People kind of realized that wasn't a good idea. So they created the Central Command, where authority rests with the Central Command and then the different. So we studied that, you know, how are we going to, and it was the Mother and Child Initiative that made clear to us, trying to put a coordinating role where agencies work together and you have leads from agencies coming together as a unit is not going to work, because until someone like the Central Command has total authority and the budget, because the money, if you have authority and no budget, you have no authority. You have no real power. So it had to sit somewhere like the Central Command. And there was a lot of debate. AID thought just in AID, HHS thought just in HHS. There were, Paula Dobronsky was charged as Undersecretary of State that oversaw these issues to try to make this work. But it was clear it wasn't going to work that way, and the fights were horrible. AID came to one meeting, we're like, we have a deal for you, HHS, you take treatment, we'll take prevention, because they didn't think treatment was possible. Tommy really wanted the deal, I had to talk him out of it. But it was clear none of that was ever going to work. And MTCT made that possible, we'd say the Central Command, so the decision was made. And the other really telling thing that some of us brought to the table, when I was out in the field, I would go into a village and you would have CDC and USAID doing a prevention program in a village. The people from CDC and AID had no idea that there was a AID or CDC program in the same village. The ambassador had no idea what anyone was doing, because no one ever told the ambassador what they were doing in the country, which means the country had no idea what the US was doing in that country. So that makes no sense either. And there's a diplomatic advantage of this. So the only thing we could come up with was, well, there's one person in a country that actually represents the president and has authority, and that's the ambassador. And then you have the State Department, which is the most powerful department, and you know, the top ranked cabinet member. And you know, Condi was becoming Secretary of State, who's basically the president. They call each other brother and sister, seriously, not in the way people informally use it. That having the power of state would also be important. But most importantly, by having the ambassador centralized, we could then require the agencies to report to the ambassador and do operations plans and everything as a government. And then because state, and this is so critical, and I get called all the time, every time someone wants to do a new initiative, Ebola, you know, COVID, whatever, you know, the reason it worked is because state doesn't implement. So state would never own all the money itself, because they would never implement a multi-billion-dollar program. If you ever give money to an agency that has implementation capacity, and then say, and bring in all the others, they will never bring in all the others. They will take all the money, which we knew from several past initiatives. The LIFE initiative that was in AID that was supposed to include CDC but never did. I mean, PMI was supposed to, President's Malaria Initiative was that AID was supposed to include CDC, never did. That was post, but we knew it was never going to work. So that's why the structure happened. It was the best of, you know, Church's old line, you know, democracy is is the worst system on earth except for every other one. It was basically this is the best of the worst. And it worked.
Do you remember the legislation signing?
That I remember really well.
Do you want to tell us about it or how you experienced it?
Well, it was at State for the reason we just talked about. That was these people are so smart. And by the way, I was not a fan of President Bush's, and I assumed everyone around him was just a very far right, unreasonable, not intelligent person. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life, which is a great lesson for me in public caricature. He's the opposite of the public caricature. He's one of the smartest, best read, most compassionate, humble people I've ever met. And the people around him, the true people around him, the Josh, the Mark, the best government servants, the best people I've ever come across. So it was a real lesson for me because I literally, when I got sent down, I had the same conspiracy theories in my mind. What are they up to? What do they really want? Is this for show? They are so smart. So they put it at State. Normally something that big is always going to be at the White House. They put it at State to make clear this is where it sits. Not at AID, not at CDC, not here. And that was a big deal. That was a huge deal. It was in the auditorium there, which I don't know if you've ever been in. There's actually a sitting room for the president behind it, which is next to the transition offices, which is where we all went to sit after the signing, which is kind of funny in and of itself. And as I mentioned, the only two Democrats to show up were Barbara Lee and Betty McCollum, because the rest were sitting it out because of what was put in the House and then the push through in the Senate, even though the Senate, if they could have, would have amended it. Lugar and Frist and the rest of them didn't agree with a whole bunch of what was added. But they wanted the bill done. So, the internet, the AIDS, AIDS Inc. was there, the NGOs. And I remember talking with Jay Lefkowitz before the meeting, and he looked up and was like, we don't have more than 5 votes in this room. They knew this was not a political winner for them. They was doing it because the president wanted to do it.
Okay, so the legislation is signed, and you get tasked with working in the Office of National AIDS Policy and kind of starting to get PEPFAR off the ground while waiting for confirmation of the first coordinator and all of the
naming a coordinator, confirmation, and then the budget, and the last one being the most important.
Yes, yeah. So tell us about this, about you said, oh shit, someone has to do this, and now...
Yeah, and I didn't think I would have to be one of them. Yeah. So we were at the Office of National AIDS Policy. Joe Neal was the director of the Office of National AIDS Policy, so he was kind of in charge. He was in charge from our office. Jay and Gary and everyone was still very involved. Tracy Carson, who is still in PEPFAR, career civil servant, but assigned to the Office of National AIDS Policy. Carol Thompson. And then a woman, Karen, God, I can't believe I'm blanking on her last name. She got married and I'm confused. I'm not remembering her maiden name and her married name. And we were kind of the core team that were working on advancing things. We were really focused on the technical pieces. Joe was more involved in the political stuff. The White House was doing interviews for the coordinator. Randy's recently written about that. And so we were just slugging away, having fights, shouting matches with all the community people. One of the biggest ones was, it's $15 billion. You're putting up $1.5 billion the first year, which was a tripling of the budget. And screaming and saying, you're not serious about this. It should be $5 billion a year. We're like, what are you talking about? If we put up $5 billion a year, we cannot spend $5 billion the first year. There's no way, and we pointed to Botswana and everywhere, so there's no way countries are going to absorb $5 billion in 1 year. And if we only spend 1.5 and 3.5 isn't spent, the program is dead. So we have to set goals that are reachable, aggressive but reachable, which we'd already done, and then pay for it. And we had the budget was based on the goals that were set, which was a scale up. Low the first year, 125,000 in therapy the first year, but getting to 2 million in the last year, which is the hockey stick you do for every new program. Doesn't matter what it is, it always works that way. But they're like, you're not serious. It wound up being $6.5 billion. So I was like, afterwards, I was like, so do you still want $5 billion a year? I mean, people just didn't think. So we had fights. They were fighting with people all the time.
Who were some of the big kind of orgs that were engaging?
One was very involved. A lot of the big INGO implementing NGOs, they were partially advocating that they get all the money and partially advocating for things that they think need to be done. Everyone's got an opinion in Washington. Evangelical community very involved, the Catholic Church very involved, Catholic Relief Services, which became a big implementer, does so much healthcare work. The Catholic bishops were very important at every stage. So there were all, just a constant flow in and out while we're trying to do the technical work. And then Randy got named. It was actually at his press conference in the Roosevelt room. Bush just wanted to announce he was Assistant Secretary of State level. The president does not hold press conferences for it, but he wanted to make clear to everyone, this is really important to me, because we counted, there were like 77 presidential initiatives, the State of the Union address. The president didn't know about 76 of them. He wanted to make clear, this is the one I care about. So no one in the press really cared. It was in the Roosevelt. So there was a lot going on at the time. So the two of the things that came out during that press conference, one of them was bring him on, and the other was I believe in civil unions. People who love each other should love each other, and I don't believe in a constitutional amendment for same-sex marriage. Those were two pretty controversial things. So that's what came out of the announcement of the Global AIDS Coordinator. I remember Ari Fleischer, who was the press director of communication, press director at the time, was sitting at. The Roosevelt room is also tiny. He was sitting like leaning up against the table. I looked over at him. You could see his eyebrows going up. He's like, "Oh no." A whole lot of stuff happened as a result of that. But then Randy got confirmed. We were still plugging away. Before he got confirmed, we were still in the transition office, which is in the basement of the State Department. We had 8 people. And we were continuing to do the plan, writing the strategy, getting everything kind of in place for the first appropriations. And my view, and Randy and I disagreed on this, but in the end, Randy was amazing. Absolutely amazing. He knew what he didn't know. He would always say to me, I totally disagree with you for these reasons, but if you think it's the right thing to do, I'll support you. One of them was moving money as quickly as we did. So one of the big things we did once he got confirmed was ask the ambassador in each country to assign 2 people. We didn't care what agency, but we said they can't be from the same agency, to come to Washington to work with us on developing some of the key building blocks of the plan, because I knew that if everything was centralized, the countries would resist and the agencies would be fighting all the time. So, and we wanted to make clear the ambassador was in charge and was sending people. And so in a 2-week meeting, we wrote what were called the Track 1, the big grants that got out. So my view, which Randy did not agree with, was we had to have, because Congress was not at all happy with this, including the Republicans. The first meetings with the Republicans on the Hill were absolutely brutal. The clerk of the House Appropriations Committee, a guy named Charlie Flickner, he was known as Congressman Flickner. He'd been there for like 35 years. He would sit behind Jim Colby, who was the chairperson at the time, the Republican. Nita Lowey was the Democrat ranking. They just switched back and forth. But Charlie was very powerful. we had our first meeting with Charlie. I'll never forget. It was some room of like green velvet on around the table. Like, this is dead on arrival. There is zero chance we are approving this. We will pass this bill under any circumstances. You made us do the Millennium Challenge Corporation. You made us do PEPFAR. You didn't talk to us with this. There's no chance this is going to pass. Jim wasn't in the room. We were like, first meetings in the Senate with Paul Grove weren't a lot better, but Paul wasn't that aggressive. He was more about the policy pieces. He was like, how can you decide this? How can you decide that? We became very good friends. I respect him, as much or more than anyone I've ever met. But Charlie was just like, no. 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, a month later, maybe 2 months later, Congressman Flickner was no longer employed as the clerk of that committee. So the pushback was really extreme, and it was very clear to me anyway that if we didn't show progress really quickly and meet those first goals really on time and show progress, we were going to be killed. Because the Congress loved the Millennium Challenge Corporation, as they should have. But it wasn't managed very well at the beginning. So they didn't move money. They didn't get things accomplished. So we've got to move right away. So we had to have things ready to go. So as soon as the money came in, boom, we could drop the track one and we could get pills into people's mouth within a couple months. But we needed the field's buy-in, because if we wrote those, they never would have survived. So we needed the people to come in from the field. We went through a lot of policy stuff. But the big thing that they were charged with doing, and we had working groups to do it, was to write those, what were called requests for proposal or request announcements for proposal or whatever. We have various terms. But that would be a call for, I think it was $1 billion for treatment, $350 million for prevention. And the care one was, I think, maybe $200 million. Those had to be written so that the moment we had an appropriation, they could be posted in the procurement mechanisms of the U.S. government so that people could submit their proposals. And they had 30 days to submit them. We awarded them right away, and there were pills in people's mouth. The first budget was approved in January. There were pills in people's mouth in some countries in May. If we hadn't done that, if we didn't have that time, and to be honest, we didn't have the learnings from the Mother and Child Initiative. It's hugely important that we had that year of the interagency fighting. Hugely, we figured out how mechanisms work. I know you want to talk about country operations plans or COPS. That all came out of the Mother and Child Initiative. That all existed. That all of those approaches, all of those processes existed in the Mother and Child Initiative. And it was all the same people because it was the same country. So, but we knew from that the countries had the leaders in the countries, and there were, a half dozen people in CDC and a half dozen people in AID who were the leaders that everyone else would look to in those agencies and across agencies and follow. So if they were working together, and we brought in people who we knew didn't really like working with the other side, so they could sit together for 2 weeks. There's a big difference in how you behave once you sit together for 2 weeks. Every meal together, every day for 10 hours together, that it would fundamentally change if those leaders were, and if they are the ones who then come out, not us, but them going out to sell these in the country, these big proposals.
Okay, there's so much in here I want to talk about. So let me start maybe with Randy. Did you know who he was when
No idea.
Bush? No idea, right?
No, we were all like, what? And we looked up, and I knew all the people who wanted it, and it wasn't him. So we all were Googling, well, there wasn't Google then, whatever we had back then. We were trying to find out what we could about him.
What did you think? What did you expect?
I actually thought it was a really smart choice, because it had to be someone of gravitas, because you're just an assistant secretary of state. That's not that important of a job in the big picture. So it had to be someone with a lot of gravitas, and it had to be someone who understood how systems work. We were all worried that was someone who didn't have government experience, especially having lived through the Mother and Child Initiative. We were all like, ugh. And to be honest, I was watching the MCC, and Paul Applegarth is a really smart and good guy, but and came from the private sector, but didn't know how government worked, and it didn't move. Had MCC moved, PEPFAR would have not, because there's only a certain amount of money that could get sloshed around. And we basically got all the money that MCC did not, which is unfortunate because MCC is a great program, and we all thought PEPFAR would just get absorbed in MCC by the end, and probably that outcome would have been great. But anyway, and I'd never met the guy, so I didn't know anything about him. But then after the first couple of meetings with him, briefing him on, he didn't see the depth of the plan. You know, he was honest about this with me and others. He was like, he almost didn't take, he was like, I don't know about this. I mean, this could absolutely fall on its face. And because he hadn't seen the depth of the plan. He hadn't seen, you know, what we looked at the Indian Health Service, what was happening in the country. All he'd seen was the big, you know, big picture stuff. So we briefed him on it. He was like, if someone had shown me this before, I would have said yes immediately. And so we developed a very good relationship. And even though I wasn't, you know, there were two deputies to him, John Lang and Joe O'Neill, we developed a relationship very quickly. And so when he and I would back channel a lot around the deputies, because they were fighting with each other all the time. But he and I developed a really great relationship and a very trusting relationship. And he was phenomenal. I mean, had we not gotten around, had we gotten who you would normally get, most CEOs, I don't know how many you've worked with, think they know everything and no one else knows everything. Everything is top down. Randy's the opposite. He's so confident in, you know, his ability to manage people and to pick good people and to see who the good people are and put them in the right job. And he doesn't have this overwhelming ego that he has to be in the middle of everything. He's like, you tell me, I know you're going to tell me when there's a problem, you know. And he didn't want to get involved in all that. I was like, that's not what I'm here for. I'm here for strategy, make sure everyone gets aligned, do what I can politically, but I'm not here to get into the middle of all that. I need to know, you know, but that's not my job, that's your job. So he's phenomenal. Without him, you know, we would have gone the way of MCC.
I was just reading his new memoir, and so I wanted to ask about, so the legislation that passed required a strategy document, and he was very insistent that this be like a serious document, right? Not just checking a box, but the plan for the first 5 years of PEPFAR. What do you recall of that first plan? And getting
it was a nightmare. So the PC, memoirs are short, and memoirs are more what you were doing, not what everyone else was doing. Yeah. So the first strategy was not written internally. It was written by an external consultant, which I was not at all happy about, but I wasn't, the people at the deputy level decided that's how we were going to do it. I was like, there's no way anyone from the outside is going to be able to write this. There's no way. So they picked someone with the usual background, great guy. I mean, I know him personally. He's a very great guy. But the first what he wrote was what you would expect. It was a check the box, more of the same stuff. So when the first version came, I sent Randy a private note. I was like, I have deep concerns about this. It looks like more of the same, nothing creative, doesn't really reflect the vision the president's expressed, you've expressed. I think it would be a mistake to release this strategy. He agreed completely, and we basically threw that away and rewrote it internally. So it wasn't 8 to 10 hour days. It was 18-hour days. There were a very small number of us. And he actually called, Joe wanted to run it, so Joe did nominally run it, but he didn't write any of it. Randy wasn't writing, and he read versions, but he's not writing. So he called and asked me to take charge of it. I was like, I can't, Joe's my boss, and he wants to do it. He's like, that's fine, just write it. So a small group of us did all the writing, and we made assignments, and and then Randy, put his touches on it. But the importance of it was that it showed that we were doing things differently, that there was going to be accountability, that was going to be country-owned, that we were going to operate differently. We were going to be one U.S. government, none of which was in the original, drafted thing. Eisenhower's phrase, the strategy stuff's important, but, and that's how you prepare for a battle, but once a battle starts, it's not what you do. Randy sent me a note after that we released the strategy. It was like, I guess it's okay because no one said anything, which is exactly what we want. No one said anything. It just kind of existed. But I don't know that anyone ever looked at it the day after it was published. But it sent the message that we wanted to send, which were, this is not the usual way of doing things. It's going to be one government. The countries are in charge. Our country teams have to work. That it was focused on those things. But also, we have goals. We're going to measure them every 6 months. And we're going to report on them publicly. We're going to tell people when we're having problems and why. We're going to report, the amount of time I spent on the Hill, always in a bipartisan way, which is one of the great lessons. Always do it bipartisan, because eventually someone else is going to be in power. And give them data, give them information. They're smart people. We are blessed with really talented people up there. And I would get yelled at all the time, both when I was working with Randy and then when I was the head of it. Stop meeting with staff, then I'm going to have to meet with staff and I want to meet with the member, and you're giving them too much information. They're just going to ask for more. I'm like, why do you think you're earmarked to death? They're all smart people. If you talk with them, I don't want to give names, but I'll tell you who the superstars out there are. Paul Grove, Tim Reeser. These are phenomenal people. Aaron over at Lowy's office, who's still there. The House cycles more. Joan Condon's still cycling around over there. But they're phenomenal people, deeply smart people. And they always had more junior people working with them. But back then we would work directly with them because it was such a big deal. And Mitch was chair of the committee. Even when he was minority leader, he was still chairing, because he cared so much about it, still chairing the subcommittee. So we spent an enormous amount of time with them explaining, and I would tell them, and be honest, this isn't working. This is what we're going to try. And they, like Randy, they would say, I don't think that's going to work. I would do this, but come back, I know you're going to come back and tell me how it went. And we always did. And so this is astounding. For this big of an initiative, after the first year, we never had another Senate Appropriations Committee hearing before they passed the bill. The House always did, because the House had to. But the Senate only had one. I called Tim. I was insulted. I was like, Tim, why are you not having a hearing on the PEPFAR? Like, I don't need one. You give me more information. I can't even read all the stuff you're giving me. I know what you're doing. I don't need a hearing. I need a hearing for all the people who don't tell me anything. And he was like, look, I've been doing this for 35 years. If they don't tell me what they're doing, I'm going to tell them what to do. So, work with people. And they had great ideas. And also, if you told them exactly what you're going to do, they're like, don't tell me that. And I'm not going to give you an opinion on that, because I have to, So I asked them, if I do these, if we do these indicators, are you okay with them? I'd be like, that's up to you, because they need to reserve judgment on it. But they knew that we were going to be telling them every 6 months what was happening. We were going to report publicly what was going to, and that's why it was so fundamentally different and new. And that's what was in the strategy. That's what we needed people to know, and then we had to actually act on it. But as a page by page, day to day.
You mentioned the Track 1 partners. Will you tell us a little bit about this emergency rollout? Why take this approach? Why the partners that became involved? And, tell us a little bit about the RFPs and all that.
Yeah, so the RFPs were written, designed by the people in the countries, as I mentioned. That's why one of the reasons we brought them back. And we always had a CDC and an AID lead for each of the proposals, and that was hugely important. And I always picked the people who were among the most respected, but also who weren't necessarily known as players across the CDC-AID divide. And they became incredibly close friends who became allies. And we also built then this system of allies throughout the countries, which was hugely important, who were willing to go to bat because they saw how important it was and saw the depth of, that this wasn't, they all came with the same suspicion I had, that this wasn't, a game, this wasn't a sham. And that they could actually have a huge impact and influence it if they would actually play along. Play along is the wrong word. If they would step up and lead. And that's the thing about people in government. No one goes into government so they can fight over what budget they control. It's a little bit like experts. You start off as this very optimistic, open-minded, and then things don't turn out quite the way you did, so you turn into. If you give 80% of people in the government or any place the opportunity to do something bigger than themselves, to contribute to someone's life more than themselves, especially people going to development, they'll do it. They just have to really believe they have that opportunity, and that's what that was all about. So the RFAs themselves, as I mentioned, it was crystal clear to me that we had to move money really quickly and show progress really quickly, or we were going to lose Congress, and we were going to lose all the supports. The countries were going to give up, and so we had to move really quickly. And because we're the U.S. government, there's a way. You can't just give money away. There are processes. So we had to be ready to go, and it would take too long for each of the countries to put their own thing out. So we needed big RFAs that had a central component, but were implemented by the countries, which is why we brought the country teams there, so that they would actually put all these important component pieces in. So the thing most people don't, well, I don't know if this is the case anymore, but the thing most people don't understand about procurement is political appointees are above a certain level. You are not involved in procurement. Procurement is an established system. You have RFAs, you have committees, they rank, there's a decision made. Politicals can make a decision within a ranking, but really you have to go with what the now how those groups are created is something that I actually changed while I was coordinator, and that you can, but you can't get involved in it. So the agencies selected the winner. So we had I think in the end there were 2 HHS, 1 HRSA, 1 CDC, and 2 USAID treatment ones, and I think 4 or 5 prevention ones and 4 or 5 care ones. I don't remember. But that was all done. They were selected based on the submissions and what the committee reviewed. That's how they were selected. But they had to move quickly, and we made that very clear that they were going to be judged, and we were going to move money around. That was the thing about collecting data. If people weren't performing, we were going to move money. That was from individual partner to country, which is why we had the operations plan by partner, so that we would be able to track, who's moving and who's not by partner and by country. And the countries then made that very clear to the partners that if they're not moving, they'll just move the money to someone who is. And so that's why things moved so quickly, and why we were able to show results quickly. But in that hockey stick, I remember with Josh Bolton about something else, which is a great story separately. And about 3 months in, about six months in, because the first year goal was 125,000. The 6 months in, it was about 6 months, and there was something happening that we had to meet with Josh about when he was at OMB at this time. And he was like, so where are we on treatment? I was like, we're up to 25,000. And he looked at me, he was like, 25,000? You've been out there for 6 months, 25,000? We've got to get to 2 million? I was like, Josh, yes. We're building the system so that you can then enroll rapidly, but you're not going to enroll a lot of people quickly. We have to build those systems. And we even did the calculation on how much it cost when we were reauthorizing, because I knew they'd want to know this. It cost $6,000 to get a person in treatment for the first 6 months. It cost $600 after the first 6 months, because you then had the infrastructure to keep enrolling. So Josh was an OMB guy, so I explained this stuff to him, so he got it. He was like, please don't do that again. But we did move quickly, and we went up to the Hill all the time. We briefed them all the time, but those RFAs were pertinent. Those RFAs then became very important as part of our strategy for transition and sustainability, which unfortunately was not carried forward in the way we'd hoped it would be. But without them, we would have gone the way of the MCC.
Okay. Well, so will you talk a little? So you've talked about these initial meetings, right? The 2 folks from every country being tapped by the ambassadors. Genuinely, everyone we interview hates talking about the country operating plans. Tell us about these. Tell us about getting them off the ground and how they work.
Yeah. It's funny. Everyone's got a love-hate relationship with everything, right? So the country operations plans, we actually had them in the Mother and Child Initiative because, and they became more important going back to what I mentioned before, because you literally had a circumstance before where you'd have CDC and AID operating a prevention program in the same village without anyone knowing that they were doing that, and certainly not the US government knowing what they were doing because they never reported, which means the ambassador didn't know, and the country didn't know what was happening in there, which was a mess, right? So the purpose of the country operation plan was to have, and it had to be submitted by the ambassador, which meant that the agencies had to work together, and the ambassador had to certify that this was coming on behalf of the agencies. So they wanted, CDC would send their plan, AID would send their plan, DoD would send their plan, and we'd have to deal with it. No, you're sending one plan. That was in the strategy, one plan. And it has to come from the ambassador, and the ambassador has to write a letter certifying that this was an interagency process, that they certified that this was the US government plan. And that didn't go over so well. And there were a couple of countries where they refused to work together. So we got the deputy principals to travel to those countries, and we unified on the stage, said, we're here to tell you, you either work together or you're gone. There's no in between. So the country operations plans were essential for multiple reasons. One, to get the US government together. Second, to have clear focus on goals. Because you can start spending money on a lot of ways, but you had to show in the plan how you were working towards achieving, and each country wasn't just global, each country had goals for prevention, care, and treatment, because that's how you get to the overall goal. And you can't do it, just making it up. It has to be country by country based on the size of the country, population infected, people at risk. There's a lot of calculations that go into that. So you have to, and then you have to follow the data to know if you're making progress or not. And you need to know which partners you're doing and what programs you're doing to get to those goals. And we always use cascade indicators. And a cascade indicator is on antiretroviral treatment. We didn't ask for which logistics system did you build, we asked for how many people you have on treatment, because then you have to build all those things. Mm-hmm. But we wanted to see in an operations plan that they understood to get to those goals, that to do those things, they're not going to spend money on a bunch of stuff that's never going to get you to that goal, which the US government has a long history of doing, because again, everything was judged by how much money you were spending, not what goals you were achieving. The other really important piece of this is what we talked about with the countries. The countries didn't believe that we actually were going to do national scale up, and didn't believe we would work with them. So part of what the ambassadors were doing was creating, and they each did it in a different way, groups with countries, because the countries also had to certify the operations plan. The Minister of Health or someone else had to say, this is coming from, we've seen this, and we accept, this is what we know will happen in our country. So it was the first time the countries actually knew what the US government was doing in their countries, which helped them organize. So for all the complaining and all, which I totally understand. Look, we know what a burden it is. It is, it's a lot of work. But as an example, in the third year, or fourth year, for the fourth year, so third year going into the fourth, I proposed to Randy, and I was the coordinator at that time. I basically said, if you've met your goals for the last 2 years, you don't have to do a COP. You need to do a high level one, but you don't have to do a COP. They all did them anyway. They did them because they needed to know what they were doing as a country and how they were going to stay on track. And they needed to tell the government what they were doing in their country. So they did them anyway. So yes, complain about them all you want, but they saw the value in them so much that when they were told they didn't have to do them, they still did them.
What year was it, or where in this did it switch from the ambassador being responsible to there being a country coordinator?
Coordinator.
Yeah.
So in the beginning, that was ad hoc. It was always the ambassador who had the authority.
Okay.
At least as long as I was there. I mean, I don't know if it ever formally switched. But ambassadors are pretty busy. They've got a whole bunch of other stuff to do. So we realized that there had to be someone under them working day to day to keep the agencies together, because otherwise the agencies were going to do what they always do. So we started putting Tracy Carson was a country coordinator in Tanzania when I was she switched to that. So we actually suggested that ambassadors get a coordinator. Now, we didn't care. It could be a State Department person. Our only thing is they couldn't be formally from one of the agencies, because then they're going to be beholden to the agency. Now, some of them were paid for or seconded by, but in that role, they did not have an attachment to the agency. So some places picked someone in the State Department, often their economic person or their political person. Sometimes they, like in Kenya, Buckingham was clearly the coordinator, because the government trust the deputy chief of mission and the chief of mission trusted him completely. So some of it happened organically, but it was very clear that we needed that, because otherwise the agency people just wouldn't work together.
So I noted how diplomatically you said some of the countries struggled. Can you give us an example of a place where they were not, where CDC and USAID were struggling to get on board?
The two worst in the beginning were Tanzania and Ethiopia. And again, and this is one of the wonderful things about finding people in the agencies, what I was talking about before, that 80%. 20% still will, fight for their turf, but 80% won't. And there are amazing people, the Connie Carinos, of the world, R.J. Simons, so many. I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you a full list because there are so many of them. Michelle Malone Kitts, God, I'm blanking on the woman from Ethiopia. Rob Kunin, all these people, Tom Kenyon, that literally saw the opportunity to make a difference, which is what they knew that they were sacrificing their long-term careers, because as soon as things passed on and things shifted back, the old agency allegiance stuff was going to come up. So they willingly, they were like, yeah. So we would go together and stand, as I said, sit up there and just say, this is not working. You either get on board or you literally will be ordered out of country and out of agency. You're done. Your career is done. And sometimes people didn't get in line and they left. So there were other countries, and sometimes there was one person, everyone else was doing okay, but there was one person. So it was a mix. But what was really important is we had from the headquarters level, the people in the agencies who make decisions. And that was one of the challenges, but it worked because this coordinator controlled all the money. We were perfectly willing to take the money from one agency and give it to another, and they knew it. So the leaders understood that they were going to lose programs, money, control, if they didn't follow what we needed done.
Will you talk a little bit about these early years and the kind of relationship with the Global Fund, right? So you talked earlier about, I think when we were talking about the prevention of mother to child transmission, right? Like choosing countries where the Global Fund was not as highly invested. How is this working in the early years of PEPFAR?
Not as well as any of us wanted it to. We always saw the Global Fund as an extension, as the multilateral extension of PEPFAR. We were by far the largest contributor. Tommy Thompson became chair of the board for that reason. The Secretary of Health and Human Services of the United States has a lot to do, and being willing to become the chair of the board is pretty substantial. And Bill Steiger dedicated enormous amounts of his time to the Global Fund. And it's because of that we did better than we otherwise would have. But the Global Fund was just dead resistant. Richard Feacham, the first executive director, was furious. He thought at the State of the Union, all the money was coming to the Global Fund. And they were just furious. They also didn't have any systems. I mean, their systems were non-existent. I mean, when I took it over, the systems were non-existent. We had to build them all. They treated it like a little NGO. They just thought, if they did good stuff, they could, they could get away. And they could, because the advocacy community loved them and the international community loved them, and they didn't have the same type of oversight at all, which is why they got in so much trouble with the Inspector General and stuff later on, because they didn't build what was necessary for an organization. They built what was necessary for a $50 million a year organization. But they had no systems to actually do things. We had systems. That's why we that's why we made it. We had a whole back and forth with the White House of why not, the president gave the first and the second gift to the Global Fund. Are we undermining our international position? Are we undermining our policy position? Or does this make sense? How is this coherent? And we knew there would be political backlash from different groups on it. But we're also looking at our job is not to play all of that. Our job is to make sure that goals are met. And we had capacity, granting capacity, technical capacity that the Global Fund just doesn't have, and the countries don't have. So let's us go in now, get it all started. And without PEPFAR, the Global Fund never would have gotten off the ground. They never would have ever gotten the systems in place. And even some of the people who attacked us the most admitted that to me afterwards. They would never say it publicly, and some of them were so Marxist, they were like, but we still should have given it all to the Global Fund because the multilateralism is better. And I was like, but all those people would have died. They're like, yes, but there's a bigger principle at mind. Well, tell that to the people who would have died. Without the PEPFAR. But as part of the transition planning, I went to the Global Fund in 2007, and into 2008 and said, let's start in 4 or 5 countries where we have the same principal implementer, the government or agency. And Tracy Carson was in Tanzania. Tanzania was one of them. I was like, we will set it up to start transitioning our financing from PEPFAR, from our bilateral programs, to the Global Fund. And part of that will be that we can transfer and support you in strengthening your accountability systems and your granting systems and all of those systems. And we'll do that actively. And let's pick 4 or 5 countries to start to show how it's done. We'll learn a lot from that and expand it out. They said no. At that point, it was a different executive director, Michelle Kazachkin. I'm certain we went to a board retreat. We were very transparent. We were like, this is how it could work. We've already kind of figured out in Tanzania how it would work, and these other 2 or 3 countries. Let's just start. They were absolutely convinced that Obama was going to come in, cancel PEPFAR, and give all the money to the Global Fund. So they thought I was trying to prevent that from happening by saying we have a transition plan. No one's ever told me that, but I'm absolutely certain that they thought I was playing a political game to try to protect PEPFAR, because people love conspiracy theories. But if we'd done the transition we wanted to do with compacts and other things that we put in place, or the track 1s, if we actually had that all been implemented, we'd be in a very different place than we are right now. But the Global Fund just said, no, not going to do it. But the relationship got a lot better. Then when I was at the Global Fund, I actually knew PEPFAR pretty well. Deb Burks, was very important in implementing PEPFAR while I was there. We worked together a lot. We saw a lot of things, not all things well, and we really started integrating. COP started including the Global Fund. And, so it's evolved to a much, much, much better place. Could still be better, but...
I want us to come back to this question about transition, but I also know that, like, personally, you are transitioning your role within the Global AIDS Coordinator Office at this time. You know, it was 2006. Tobias takes another role within state. You know, had you planned to stay as long as you did? Did you want to succeed him?
No, in fact, I'd already talked with Randy about, moving on and going, he's from the private sector. It's like, I've done the government thing. I was exhausted. I mean, you can't imagine what it was like getting this thing stood up. It's so different. The hardest thing you can do is a startup in the U.S. government across the agency, and there just weren't any people. I mean, and back then there were no cell phones, there were no laptops. You had to go in every Saturday and every Sunday to work because that's the only place you could use a computer. I was there. My husband was like, you've got to stop this, and I was just physically exhausted. And not to mention all the travel that you're doing all the time to manage with the countries and get things started and meet with the governments and assure them from the headquarters that, So I was deputy at this point. And so I talked with Randy about, what could I do in the private sector and transition out, and he was like, no, and then when he moved, I told him, well, this could be the time. And actually, the White House offered me a position as the person in the National Security Council while Randy was still there. And I was very interested in that. And there was an external position I can't tell you about that I was very interested in. And I wasn't supposed to be the coordinator. They definitely were interested, but there was someone else who was who'd been involved from the beginning, who they were going to name. I found out about that through a variety of different ways, but then they called and told me, because I had been interviewed for the position. So then I was like, oh God, thank God, now I really can go. But then that person had a health issue and backed out, and then I was their clear second choice. But the other person, had been with the Bush people since the beginning and deserved it and had done a great job. But I wasn't going to stay if for that. Mm-hmm. I was going to go.
So when you decide to take the role, I understand there was also some opposition to your appointment.
I kind of flew through.
Maybe internally to the Bush administration?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, an openly gay man with my past history, and they knew I wasn't the biggest fan of the president's until I met him and got to know him and got to know the people around him. But everyone else in the administration understood at that point I was, and they said, you're one of the most loyal people we have, because there's nothing like a convert, Mm-hmm. But there were definitely some concern at political levels about a few things. But President Bush just and Josh were just like, this is the best person for, why, this is crazy. And, they were honest too. They were like, it's not the worst thing in the world for someone like you to be running this for us.
Did you have any goals as you took this position? Things that you really wanted to achieve?
Well, I wanted to make sure that the goals were met,
okay.
On budget and on time, and they were. One of the problems with the Global Fund was there was a competition for funds. And that's why we were in a meeting with Josh that one time, because we actually had to increase. We ended up at 18, not 15. And the reason for that is Congress kept increasing the allocation of the Global Fund, but we knew we couldn't meet the bilateral goals without the budget. So the only way to fix that is to increase the budget, which required the president and Josh, which was not easy. I mean, coming up with that extra money was not, it was very, very difficult, but they did it every time. So that was part of it. But I wanted to be able to make sure that we met the goals on time and on budget to set the example. And then the other major thing I wanted, well, two things. One, work for a real transition, real sustainability, which was actually in the original documents. My original name for it included the word sustainability, which was way too long and even messier than PEPFAR. But it was in the strategy, it was in all the documents. Capacity would be built, we would move on. That's why the Indian Health Services in Alaska was so important, because that was the goal. Not to take 50 years to get to the point of a treaty and a passing of money with a regular audit, but to get there within 5 years. So, we put in, I did as coordinator, the way it worked is all the money came to the coordinator, and then the coordinator, you did an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with each of the agencies with X amount of money to perform X things, most of which came out of the COP. But in 2007, I put in a requirement that in every grant that was signed going forward, there had to be a clause that the program had to be turned over to a local organization within 5 years. And that was absolutely put in the track ones. And HHS did it because Steiger was there and just was a bulldog and made them do it. And that's why they had so many local partners, and USAID refused to do it. I actually only half-jokingly threatened to sue them because they were breaking the law. They actually signed an MOU saying they would do it, and then they kept putting out RFAs that didn't have the clause in it. And they refused because they wanted to keep control over the money and getting back to the agency thing. And they really thought over time, all this was just going to go away, which led to the other goal, which was reauthorization. So I went to the president early and pitched really hard that we reauthorize. And he was like, why? Well, you don't need to be authorized to appropriate. It's going fine. By the way, we've got a lot of other political battles going on and a lot of other priorities, and we don't quite have the strength that we once had in Congress. But I explained to him that if it weren't reauthorized, the countries would lose all confidence that this was going to continue, because they weren't sure. Early on, they were like, we're not doing this because you're going to leave like you always leave, and then we're going to be holding the bag for all this, and we can't afford that. I was like, if you don't reauthorize, there's no way we're going to convince them to continue enrolling people in treatment, and there's no way this goes forward. And internally, without you there, without the president making sure, we don't know the next president's going to do the same thing you did. The agencies are going to devolve back, and AID was already planning for that. So it's very important to get reauthorization done. So those were my main goals: achieve the goals, put in place what was necessary for transition, which led to compacts. I had an agreement with Zuma. Zuma came to my office when he was elected. I was an assistant secretary. He came to my office when he was elected head of ANC, not when he was yet president of the country. And he said, I heard you think PEPFAR should be out of my country in 5 years, because I told our ambassador, who's great, Hume, to do that. I was like, yeah, that's correct, because there's no reason you shouldn't be able to pay for this. And he said, no, you're absolutely right. We should be able to. All I ask is that we have 5 years and that you don't do it on your own, that you work with this is going to be my Minister of Finance, this is going to be my Minister, let's all work together and we can do this. Then the financial crisis hit, and South Africa was much more impacted because they were more engaged in the banking system, international banking system, than anyone else. But instead of switching to an 8-year plan, everyone just went back to funding them at the same level, even though the president already said we can pay for this. I mean, it's just insane. But we started the compact. Compacts are in the 2008 reauthorization that we should be putting in place compacts with the country. Now, the lawyers didn't like the word compact because it's legally binding and all this other stuff. I can't remember. They may have used another term. But we instructed our ambassadors, especially in the countries that had resources, to put in place 5-year transition plans. And they worked on them. They were ready to go. And then Eric picked that up. By the way, Eric Gooseby picked that up. But because of the financial crisis and a lot of other things, and because the president wasn't as engaged in the same way, Hillary, the Secretary of State was, but the president wasn't. The countries, and there was so much pressure in the international system and the NGOs to keep things going that I understand, but I really regret that we really didn't. And the transition to the Global Fund was a piece of that. So it was a global responsibility, not just a U.S. responsibility. But really, we could have done full transitions or close to full transitions, so that we wouldn't be in this mess that we're in today had we done any of that stuff. And then we needed to reauthorize, and that was a brutal reauthorization. Every day it looked like it was going to fall apart, and it was a real reauthorization. It was a full-on, 300, the usual bill. Brutal fights about earmarks, and they'd already been waived. The absence, the appropriators, as soon as the Democrats got in, need to waive that. It didn't exist. Prostitution pledge was still there, but the Democrats didn't really care that much about that, because we weren't the way we implemented it. We just, administratively you can implement the law without. There are ways to implement the law that are different. That's why we put treatment. PMTCT, which has the word prevention into treatment, because it was 20% of the prevention budget, or 33% of the prevention budget had to go for ABC. Well, if you have PMTCT in there, your denominator is much bigger. If you move PMTCT out, your denominator goes down, so your 20% is much lower. Plus, we allowed people to prorate. If they had a condom program as part of an ABC program, they could prorate the amount spent on condoms within that, and that counted towards the earmark. The conservatives found out, we sent a report telling them we were doing this. Yeah. They don't read reports. I mean, they did. But eventually they figured it out, and they put holds on the bills for appropriations for a while, but we got through it. So there are administrative ways to do all this stuff. But it was a brutal reauthorization. And a little bit like Josh, in a very different level, everyone wants to be involved in things like reauthorization. It's Congress and bills and meetings all the time. And it's like, no. Some of us are going to spend all our time on this, like me. The rest of you go do your jobs. Yeah. You're not going to be involved. Don't ask to be involved. We don't want you involved. We want you doing your work. But it was brutal. It was, except for getting everything started and running, and it was the toughest thing I've ever done.
Can you remember some of the actors who helped it get through? I remember from the Miller Center interview you did, the context is very different, right? The Democrats have the House
and Senate.
And the Senate. Okay, they have Congress, right? Conservatives had gained ground amongst the Republicans, and it's an election year. What are some of the big fights that are being had, and who are some of the people who...
Well, internally,
help you get it over the hump?
Internally, it was very different because, as you get to the 7th, 8th year of an administration, the people who were in leadership roles that you worked with to get everything started aren't in those roles anymore. They've all moved on to be ambassadors, secretaries, assistant secretaries, or they've gone, I'm talking about in the White House, or they've gone back into the private sector. And it's kind of a rule that if you're still there a year before the term ends, you're there till the end. So a lot of people leave before that year, and this was in the last year. So a lot of players were different. Mike Gerson was gone. Josh, thank God, was still there. Kristen had moved on. Joel Kaplan was there, and he was deputy chief of staff. But a lot of the key people who'd been involved from the beginning were gone. Carl wasn't even there. And even down at lower levels, in the director level, the people who couldn't get director levels in the first 6 years are now directors, right? So there was a lot of internal difficulty around family planning and abortion. And unfortunately, the first version of the House bill which I warned them was going to be a problem, was a massive problem because they mentioned reproductive health 1,000 times. And and said family planning and reproductive health. I was like, don't do that. Mention family planning a few times here, mention reproductive health, but don't put them in the same clause because then they're going to be seen as the same thing. They got seen as the same thing, and they were in there 1,000. And we knew the end of the bill was going to have it mentioned 3 or 4 times, but it wasn't going to be 30 times. But there's this mentality in Washington: dump, it goes back to those memos. Dump as much as you can in, because then you're going to have to backtrack. Not here, because we all understood where the landmines were. So don't do that, because it's going to all blow up. So it was a constant. I mean, every other day, literally every other day, every other week, I was like, this is not going to get through. We're not going to get. In the end, it was the president, it was Josh Bolton, and Deb Fidelke, who was the person in Ledge Affairs assigned to it, who did not like me at all at the beginning, because she thought I wasn't, playing on their team. And then there were a bunch, they were fighting on a bunch of other stuff, and they're like, this doesn't help us on anything, and we have to have the absence. I'm like, it's gone. It's been gone for 2 years. Why are we fighting for something that's already gone? And you had to deal with different faith communities. The Catholic Church cared about the abstinence and fidelity pieces. All the evangelicals have never understood why Catholics don't use condoms. They're like, what's the difference between that and natural timing? But they'll never separate with the bishops on key issues, because they need to stay together on abortion, which they both want to fight. So different faith-based groups cared about things differently, and it was just very complicated. And then you have the international community, the regular NGOs seeing, you've got Democrats in the House and the Senate, so we can make it our bill. Which means it will never get through, or the president won't sign it. So it was lots of late nights, lots of negotiations, lots of nightmares, but really good staff. Tom Lantos was alive for the first part of it, and just an absolute hero, and his staffer Peter and the rest of his team. And then Berman came in and didn't know anything about it. He just deferred to the staff. I was like, Tom would have wanted this done. You guys just get it done. If you need me help, but just get it done. So we had some the toughest was the House, and the toughest was we had 1 day of final hashing out, and it was brutal. Went till like 11, 12 in the morning. But then they voted the next morning and got it. We did all the final wording and got it through. Then when it went to the Senate, we had a few issues, but we basically managed those pretty easily. And then, the Senate did make some changes, which was going to be a problem when it went back to the House, because the House had to adopt the Senate version. And the only way to do that, and the House was clear. There was one amendment in the House that almost killed it, by Paul Ryan. I'm from Wisconsin. My family lives in Paul's district. He was a young guy then, but he was chair of the budget committee. So I went to see him. He was like, "Boy, you must be in trouble if you're coming to see me." I was like, "No, I need the amendment you're going to submit to recommit to committee as chair of the budget committee." This was $50 billion. It was like, it will kill this. He was like, "There's nothing I can do. I have to do it." It was very close. We had very few Republican votes on that, and we needed a few Republican votes to pass it. I think we only got 16 Republicans on that. But then once we got through that, and because it had gone back to the budget committee, it was dead. So when it had gone back to the appropriations committee, it was dead. And there were a couple other efforts. Pence was a hero, gave a brilliant speech on the floor at the final passage. But that amendment we were really worried about. Then we carried everything else. And then in the Senate, there's the big mess with the mint in the Senate before we get to the House. So there were a couple of amendments that were problems. We had to do in the committee, and Biden asked me to actually come and be at the committee in case any questions came up, which infuriated me because I had to cancel a trip I've been planning for 3 years. But I had to go. of course, I didn't have to say anything. But there was, because of the family planning debate that was going on, Senator Boxer wanted to make sure that the language that was left protected, family planning, which it did. No one was ever fighting about family planning except for a couple of nutcases in the White House. The president believed in family planning. I mean, there were executive orders on family planning. There's a reason PEPFAR was exempt from Mexico City. I mean, these were just, rehab. Again, new people. In committee, there had to be a colloquy between Boxer and Biden. Senator, Mr. Chairman, does this mean X, Y, or Z? The senator saying, yes, that's exactly what it means. Fine, everyone votes. And Senator Barrasso, who was not yet elected, he had been appointed after the death, was the only no vote in committee. And then actually predicted the numbers exactly of what we would get in the House and what we would get in the Senate. But DeMint almost killed it. So do you want to go into detail on this? We don't have to.
Yes, please.
Okay.
I was gonna say that's what we're here for.
Okay, so Brian McKeon, who's absolutely brilliant. Shannon Smith and Brian McKeon were the two main people for Biden, who was chair at the time. And then on Senator Lugar's side, there were a couple of really important people who'd been there for a long time. But we had an existing relationship with them, and as we did with the Biden people. Brian, I didn't know. He's a lawyer, but he was assigned to shepherd it for the senator, the chairman. So we would meet like literally every day as a team. And everyone was trying really hard to get everything through, and we were there. We were absolutely there. And every amendment we won. There was one that Senator Gregg wanted an inspector general, and we could have lost a lot of Republicans on that. And that it was fine to have an inspector general, but we wasted so much money, and we have an inspector general from state USA. I mean, so he was furious. I saw him after he lost that vote. He stomped right past me outside the Senate doors. He was so angry. But we won that vote. But the key vote, and that was the only other one that was close. The key vote came, Senator DeMint, at the end of the day, when there's no one in session, walked in and dropped a poison pill amendment, a secondary amendment, which they've been working so hard to prevent, because there's this thing called a tree. And if you have one secondary amendment, you can just, as a tree, you keep adding amendments onto an adding amendment. So they've done a great job. Brian was a very good floor manager. He'd been very good at, but he wasn't paying attention that day because it was end of session. He's just sitting in his office watching his TV as we all were. DeMint walks into the chamber. The Democrat is in the chair, but a junior Democrat, a new senator who didn't know the rules. So DeMint walks in and drops this poison pill amendment to insert Mexico City into PEPFAR legislation, which was dead. It was dead. And he knew it, and he wanted to kill it. Unfortunately, the Democrat in the chair, because she was so young, didn't know that she could step out as chair and say, I'm now no longer chair, I'm stepping aside. As a senator, I'm calling for a quorum. She didn't know she could do that. So she felt no choice. So she was like, without objection, and there was no one else in the chamber, and the chair cannot object. Does anyone, is there objection? Otherwise, without objection, the amendment passes. And there was no one else to object, so the amendment passes.
Did DeMint know that this was a junior person? And
I don't know if they knew.
Okay.
I don't know if they knew. They definitely knew by going in that late at night. They had a really good shot at sneaking it in. And worst case scenario, he's a showman. Even if they called for a quorum and it got shot down, he did his attempt to kill the bill. And he was forcing Republicans to vote on something that they're not really comfortable voting on. So I've never seen Brian. He turned he's pretty pale anyway, but he's very calm. He turned sheet white. He was like sweating because it was his job to get this bill through, and something just happened that he had control over. All he needed to do was make sure there was a member there, or that the chair knew that, But no one was they weren't expecting this, even though we knew DeMint was going to do something. So, the full Senate then has to vote on the amendment in order for it to be added to the bill or not. Getting really conservative Republicans to vote against that is extraordinarily difficult. Some of them have been fighting for it for a long time. But I've never been told the details of this. I think Ed Gillespie was the champion here. They mobilized everyone, the White House mobilized everyone they could in the faith community to get to every conservative senator. And Sam Brownback was very important, had just converted to Catholicism, is very close with his bishop. So the Catholic Bishops Conference called every Catholic bishop and said, get to your senator, ask them not, the 20 people who were being targeted. Wow. People got to Orrin Hatch, you need to get to Orrin Hatch, people, and that vote was 86. So we picked up like 16 of the most, Sam Brownback. We couldn't vote, there was no way to get them to vote no. So the vote, what we asked and worked with Biden and Lugar on was make the vote to table the amendment, which in other parts of the world means you take action on it. In our country, tabling it means you put it on the table and it just goes away. So we could get the votes to table it, we couldn't get the votes to say no. So because of all that effort, the next day, the vote was, which was a Friday, the vote was to table it. One of my favorite parts about all of reauthorization is the vote didn't happen till like 6 o'clock Friday. So all the members had to stay till 6 o'clock Friday, which they don't really like because they go back to their constituencies and everything. And it never really happened that someone who put an amendment forward left while everyone else was stuck there. But DeMint had flown home. So when the vote was being done and Hatch and Brownback and everyone was voting to table, and I get to DeMint and they're like absent, the chamber booed very loudly, including the Republicans, Senator DeMint, who had made them all sit there until 6 o'clock at night and gone back home himself.
Okay, well.
But once that vote was done, if you could win that vote with 85, 86 members, which is what we ended up with, which is what I knew we were going to end up with. Whereas it was passed by voice vote the first time. I mean, it actually had to go through votes. It was very difficult. There's a lot of maneuvering on a couple of really silly issues at the end. Once we won that vote, it was clear if you can win that one with that majority of that many Republicans, there's no way this isn't going through. So then it kind of flew through all the other amendments, just kind of went off. Greg had already, he almost won that amendment. A lot of Republicans voted with him. But then because there were a couple of amendments, it had to go back to the House. And here Nancy Pelosi, Nancy's an amazing woman, and she's been fighting for HIV days since her first days in Congress. And she's such a huge fan of PEPFAR and has been so important in so many different roles. She was Speaker at the time. So the only way to get back through the House was by having a closed rule. And the chair of the Rules Committee did not want a closed rule. So a closed rule is an up or down vote, right? You can't amend. An open rule or anything in between allows amendments to be considered, and there are various ways to do that. A closed rule means it's up or down. Do you accept the vote, or do you accept the bill, or do you not accept the bill? And the only way this was passing without going back through it again, then back through it again, was a closed rule. I don't know what happened or how it happened, but two important things. One, Nancy, as Speaker of the House, went to the well to make clear this bill had to pass. Speakers rarely speak on behalf of a bill and go to the well. That is a very rare thing to happen. Pence gave a great speech. She was like, look, I'm a social conservative, and I'm a fiscal conservative. I might have some issues on some of the language here, but overall, this can save millions of lives. I'm a fiscal conservative, but we rarely stand up here and vote to save millions of lives. We can save money somewhere else. This is a bill we have to pass. That was very, very powerful. But So I don't know what Nancy did with the Rules Committee chair, but we all know Nancy's ways. But somehow the Rules Committee chairperson changed her mind and submitted as a closed rule, and so it passed rapidly.
In the years between this reauthorization and the first legislation, was PEPFAR often in the news, right? I mean, I'm struck today by still how few folks know about it, and I'm just wondering, is it ever in the news during these years?
No, unless there's something bad, right. Something about abortion, something about. No, and we obviously I actually went to members' districts, Republicans and Democrats. Did an event with Tom Lantos. Did an event with Nita Lowey. Did an event with Barbara Lee and a bunch of Republicans too. Ross Leighton and their districts. 3 people would show up, 5 people would show up. It's just not in people's consciousness, which is really, really unfortunate. It's a shame because it's one of the greatest things that our country's ever done, I think. Even Nick Kristof, begrudgingly admits that. And it's not just PEPFAR itself and the lives saved, which should be enough, but it's the systems that were built, the sustainability, the diplomatic benefits, the security benefits, the transformational effect on it. I mean, if the Africa before and after. Now, it's not just PEPFAR, but really, without stopping the AIDS pandemic, Africa would have been crushed. Sub-Saharan Africa would have been crushed, especially certain countries. I mean, if there are countries that could have ceased to exist, which is why President Moha in Botswana started anti-riot. He knew. I mean, the populations in Eswatini and Botswana and Namibia were dropping they're now up to around 1.5 or more million, but they were dropping to under 1 million. I mean, they had massive mortality rates. So it was transformational on the lives front, but it was really the systems piece. And that's what upsets me so much about the lack of sustainability. The systems are now there to be sustainable. It's the sociology of organizations that need to self-preserve. And as one of my African friends have said, while the delivery systems were built, the management systems were not, because we insist on controlling the management because that's how we got to keep the money. That's how we self-preserve. So all these efforts at sustainability we launched just didn't go anywhere, and that's very unfortunate, and that puts us in the position we're in because the diagnosis is correct. How you fix the problem is different, but the diagnosis right now is correct. The system should not exist as it does. PEPFAR we should be in a large way in a handful of countries based on a humanitarian basis because those countries are in civil war or otherwise can't manage. But we should be down to 100% in a good number of countries, a dozen or so. And 70 to 80% a whole bunch of other countries, and 50% a whole bunch of other countries, and then a few countries where we should still be large. And that's not just for PEPFAR, that's for everything we do in development. And we're also focused on the wrong thing. I mean, what the countries want from us is not individual programs. It is impossible for them to manage all these, just in health. The Minister of Health in Nigeria, who I've known since he was Deputy Minister of State, Muhammad Pate, because he was there when PEPFAR started. He's now coordinating Minister for Health. He just held a health financing dialogue. I mean, he's got 72 internationally financed health programs to deal with, all with their own reporting structures, it's a mess. First of all, they don't want them. Secondly, that doesn't support their health system. And thirdly, it doesn't support their economic growth and development. Health is an important component of that, but what they really need is support for economic growth and development. And that's what we tried with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. That's what F was created to do, to take the lessons from PEPFAR, not to be an accounting system of how much are we spending and can we shift some money here, but in these 5 countries, and Rob Mosbacher and I kept banging our heads against the wall. Why don't we just take 5 countries? We have large MCC, large PEPFAR, large non-AID, non-health, large PMI, large OPIC, now Development Finance Corporation, support development plans so that we can bring everything in, and then bring the private sector in, which is why OPEC would be important. Because unlike China or the Arab states, which are going big into Africa in a very dangerous way, that is no different than China and is actually in some ways worse than China because they actually will pay for civil wars. China doesn't pay for civil wars. They do a lot of other stuff, but they don't pay for civil wars. And once Russia gets freed up, they're going to go right back to what they did in the Sahel. What's different? The difference is there is no separation between the public sector and the private sector. So they can plop down $50 billion for this, $60 billion for this, $100 trillion or $1 trillion for a bridge and road initiative. We can't do that, right? So yes, while the countries are hugely appreciative, especially of the programs that basically reversed their continent, and it changed diplomatically tremendously, like in Namibia where they hated us because we were on the wrong side of their freedom fight. Now we were the only country that was supporting them, and now they love us. So, but what they need and want is not what we're doing because our private sector is so separated from our public sector. So shifting to, which is what they very much want, supporting them to develop a level playing field in their private sector, the regulatory environment, the frameworks that they need, investments, and bringing those investments. And they'd much rather work with us in Europe. But Europe, we can't fight on that playing field. That's what development is for. So yes, I don't want to see all the money go away but most of it can and should, just in a more paced way. And then we should be shifting to and resetting to a different engagement, which is better for everyone, and particularly those countries. We could save every life from HIV, TB, malaria, and every other disease, and we're still going to have, and these numbers should be eye-popping to everyone, 1 in 4 people on the planet, and 1 in 3 people between the ages of 15 and 34 will be African by 2050. If you want a world that is safer, stronger, more prosperous, resetting our engagement in Africa has got to be central to that. And it's not going to be with the way we do development. It's not going to be with individual health programs. It's not. Those were important. They made a difference. But we should have been shifting for the last 15 to 20 years. And if we'd all done our jobs and done all the things we've committed to do at Monterey and Busan, Paris, Busan, Lusaka, we would be in a very different place.
This is a good moment to transition out of the Global AIDS Coordinator role and into the Global Fund.
Oh, actually, before we...
okay.
So after the day the bill passed...
Oh, yeah.
Finally through the Senate, or through the House, and we knew we had the votes, but it was still watching. It was great. I literally sat. I sat at my desk. I was like, I don't really have anything to do, because I'd spent. That's all I did. Yeah. And I firmly believe this, which is why seeing these people in these jobs in the UN and everything else for 10 years and 15 years drives me insane. Like, if you still need to be there after 5 years, you're a terrible manager. Means you didn't take the time to build the team that can manage without you. And I was doing that anyway, but reauthorization really made me do it because I had to spend 85% of my time on reauthorization. So I literally was like, I don't have anything to do. Michelle's got programs covered, the countries are moving. I don't need to be here. So it was a great moment because I was like, this is great. I don't need to be here anymore.
Okay, and so there's also the election that year, a new presidential administration, and you are transitioning out. Tell us about, as you were leaving, advice given to those who were coming after you, and
So a couple of things on that. One is Eric Gooseby. There's a reason he was sitting in that room when they wanted to have people to talk with. Eric was on the guidelines panel, and he was the first, it wasn't called that, but he was the first head of Office of National AIDS Policy, and he ran for HHS HIV policy before that. And he was on the guidelines panel, so I'd known him for well for a couple of years. Tony's known him forever. So, I had no interest in staying at all. Josh called me and said, would you be willing to stay? I was like, no, but I would stay for a transition period. And this is the guy who should take it, by the way. So at the Mexico, which was in July or August, Mexico City International AIDS meeting, I asked Eric if we could go for a walk, and we were walking. I was like, what would you think about becoming the next U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator? This is July or August. And we're till January. He was like, you're out of your mind. No. I was like, Eric. And I talked with him for a little while, and then we had calls, and we went back and forth. And he was like, yeah, I would do it. And then there's this guy, Michael Iskowitz, who's very close with the Clintons, and not as close with the Obama people, but the Obama people were going to defer to Secretary Clinton on this. So Hillary got to know Eric, and so it was set on the inauguration day that Eric was coming in. So I was like, things will be difficult. So when they asked if I would stay, I said I'd be willing to stay. But it was really just till he got confirmed, because even though they wanted him, it still takes months and months and months to get confirmation. So Eric was amazing, and I was absolutely thrilled that he was going to be the successor, and knew he was going to be because a lot of groundwork had been done, so that he was going to be named very soon after the inauguration. So Eric and I spent a weekend together at Michael's house, but we knew each other well enough that we talked to each other all the time. But W once told me a story about his conversation with President Obama in the office, when they meet, and President Obama was like, yeah, I'm going to call you regular for advice and want to stay in touch. And W's like, no, you're not. Because the reality is, and this is the funny part about people on the outside of government, even those who have been on the inside, once you leave, you think you know what's going on, but you don't. You know like 2% of what's happening. Unless you're inside, you have no idea. So giving advice to people, you don't know 98% of what you need to know to give advice. So shut up. You can see the big things happening, and if people call, or you can say, here are some things to think about. And Eric and I talked a lot about sustainability. That was most of what we talked about. He wasn't aware of what we'd done on compacts. He went and dug and read about them, and then he spent a lot of time on them, was really moving on them, and he was moving towards systems-based stuff. But it was no longer presidential. President Obama was engaged, but, and he was fantastic, and I know this. He would always tell his most senior people when they were writing speeches and stuff, like, give President Bush credit. This was his. But it really changed from presidential to secretarial. But Eric had a really close relationship with Secretary Clinton, so that, she was very powerful. And that changed then in subsequent administrations, and even the secretary is not involved anymore. But I don't. Eric would call me periodically. He asked me to do a couple things, to support him. We stayed in touch. He would invite me, like there was a meeting between Secretary Kerry and 10 heads of state on sustainability and compacts, and he invited at the General Assembly, invited me to be part of that. So we would do things, but I know enough not to try to give advice to someone, except for big picture stuff.
So I wanted to move to your Global Fund years, with an eye towards PEPFAR, right, for the purposes of our interview, Why did you want to work with the Global Fund at this point?
Probably because I was insane. I care deeply about the Global Fund. It's the only way the international community engages. It was actually built on the Monterey Principles, which President Bush fought so hard for. Its structure it's actually kind of the right structure-ish, but not really anymore. And it was on its last legs. These Inspector General reports had come out. Germany, Switzerland, I don't remember who else, suspended their contributions to the fund. It was spiraling. The secretariat response was the usual, unfortunately, bureaucratic response. Nothing to see here. We do everything right. It's only a small percent of our, it's never the right answer when, totally unacceptable. This is what we're going to do to change. There's only one way to deal with that. And so it was just spiraling. And Michel Kazachkin and I, who have been friends since I was at NIH and he was at ANRS, we actually created together what became the largest international network of HIV research to observational research programs. IDEA. He and I created that when we were at different stages. And I think Michel's one of the greatest public health people there have ever been. He's not a manager, and he admits that. He deferred to someone else to manage, and the management wasn't where it needed to be. But so I don't think what happened is his fault, but he was the head of the organization. So there was an effort, and the US pushed very hard that he needed to step aside. And so there was a need for someone to come in, and it really, and I don't mean this, it's not because of me, it's just because of the experiences I had. I mean, we had to build an institution from the ground up, which is not reform, but it's functionally what the Global Fund needed. I knew still many of the heads of state, many of the ministers. I knew a lot of people in the international community. It seemed like I could serve the institution, and my management style is a little bit more the type of management style that they probably needed at the time. So I spoke with Eric about it. No one thought the administration would support me, but they were 100% behind me. Gail Smith's close friend, and became close friends. We had a fun conversation during the transition, actually. But it just, if the Global Fund were where it were today, like people keep calling me now and they're like, you can get 2 terms. You have 2 terms. It's like, no, zero interest. But at that moment, it was such an important institution, and it's a little, I have no interest in running things. I mean, none. I mean, some people get all their energy from that. I get none of it. I travel alone. I don't have staff. All that stuff is just nonsense to me. People are like, oh, you need travel staff. I'm like, why? What do you think you have people in the country for? And it's their country. I don't need someone to carry my bag. I can check into a hotel. I mean, for God's sakes. And it costs a fortune. Why would you spend money on that? So I don't care about that stuff. But when there's an opportunity to change things or make something contribute and serve, then I get excited. So that's why I did it. And I really tried to drill into them what I tried to drill in PEPFAR. If you're in someone else's country, you're there as their servant. You're not there as a donor. You're their servant. You might disagree with them. I mean, servants, you're not a slave. And they want you to disagree with them. They want it on equal footing. They want it as partners. And it's not really equal because it's their country, but they want respect and they deserve respect. And you have no right to go in and tell a country what to do. You can have a conversation about it, but you can't tell them what to do. You have my limitation on what you can do, but you can't tell them what to do. So that culture did not exist at the Global Fund. It did not exist in our development institutions. What's the biggest problem with our development institution? So I wanted to work in the Global Fund on that. So that's why I went and did it, and that's why I only did 1 term. No one believed me. I told them at the beginning, I was like, I'm going to do 1 term. And then when I told them a year and a half out or 2 years out, I was like, I'm not going to seek a 2nd term. No one believed me. They were like, oh, yes, you are. You're going. No, I'm not. You really need to start the process because I had to do 2 replenishments in 4 years. I was like, these are really painful. You need to get someone in a year in advance. I had 6 months to put together a replenishment. You don't want to ever do that again. You need to get someone in with a full year before replenishment. But no one, I think I am the only person to ever run an organization to actually step down after a term, to not seek voluntarily a 2nd term, because everyone just stays in these jobs, But why? I mean, it was time. Plus, it was the same with PEPFAR. When you've done the kind of building transformation, then you need someone else. First of all, you're exhausted, absolutely exhausted. And secondly, you came in with a certain vision, you did things, but then someone else needs to come in and look at it a different way. The same, once you've done the transformation part, you should not stay for the next part. You've done the pieces that you need to do. If you did your job, you put everything in place for the next person. So I felt the same way as I did the day of the bill passing. I don't have to be here anymore.
So at the time, right, Global Fund is going through this transition and you're kind of shepherding it. Will you tell us about that process and, you know, what your experience from PEPFAR brought to that?
Well, the first was systems. We had to pretend like all the systems had been built during the year before with when Gabriel Heimer was I can't remember, they wouldn't give him the term executive director. I don't remember what term they gave him. That everything was supposed to be fixed then. It wasn't. So the financial management systems weren't built. There was no really strong, I mean, one of the first things we did at PEPFAR is we built the system for accountability. We built this, and things that shocked me, like we had no mechanism to account for expenditures, just obligations. So how can you follow what's happening if you don't know what the expenditures are? They literally had to pull paper, you know, and you're 2 years behind. I'm like, that's insane. And there was no system to collect data in 6 months. There was only 6 or 7 indicators, those key indicators, but there's no system to ever do that. So you had to do all that, and you had to, you know, no supply. So it was the same with the Global Fund. You had the HR systems didn't exist. I mean, there were no built-in HR systems. There were the grant management system was the same thing. You know, at the time, male circumcision was really important for prevention. I was like, how much are we spending on male circumcision? Where are we, and what are we doing with our programs? Like, well, it'll take us 3 months. Like, 3 months? I mean, just go type into your freaking system. They're like, no, we don't keep that kind of detail. It's all in the paper grants. And think right at the time it was $3 billion. Like, how it was like a $100 million NGO. But they always thought, like many people who do this stuff, oh, as long as we're doing good work, we're fine. So all those systems had to be built. But then importantly, the culture had to change. It was a very top-down, Geneva-driven. And I knew this because I'd been on some calls with some ministries, and Eric asked me to join some of them. And the Global Fund people would literally tell the minister, no, you can't put that in this is what you're putting in your grant, or we won't approve it. I'm like, that's no way to talk to them. I mean, you're a program officer. I mean, which is what used to happen in USAID and probably does again. Well, not anymore, but until not too long ago. So it needed a culture change and a breathing room. And one of the more important things we did is it was very hierarchical. Like I started having brown bag lunches where anyone could sign up, anyone below a certain level, just so I could talk to people. It wasn't, and the senior managers went absolutely bonkers. So like, you can't meet with our people. Only we can meet with our people. It's like I was like, and when you go down for lunch, you talk to people. You shouldn't be talking to them. Or in the elevator. So the rule was you can't say anything about the manager. What I want to learn is who you are personally, what's your vision, and what are big picture things we can or should be doing better. What are you seeing in countries that we need to be working on? I want to, because you have to learn from. I used to do this that's why when I went to countries at PEPFAR, I had a rule, which I couldn't do at the Global Fund because there are too many countries, but one day in the capital, and then we're going out for the next 7. And then you meet people, and you could actually listen to them and talk to them and find out what's really happening, not what the report says. So that culture of openness, and also how you hire people and who you're looking for, finding the smartest people, the best people, and elevating them past the dead wood was essential. So we did things like to get beyond a certain level, you had to be a certified project manager, because there was no project management. It was just a disaster, mess. And then find the best people for the biggest projects that we created, like creating a pooled procurement mechanism and a few other things, that big not just digitization, but how we could reconcile our financial systems with the financial systems of the country, so that if you're going to transition, it's really hard if you don't have matching codes. The big stuff we were trying to do, just find the best people and put them in charge of it. Don't pick the people that, just because of their job type. So, we did all that. So I definitely was ready to go, and I couldn't afford to stay in the public sector again. But anyway, a lot of the things I learned from PEPFAR, which is why I was interested in the Global Fund, were very applicable to where the Global Fund was. And from a management perspective, it was easy. I mean, one of the questions I got in the interview, because people just don't understand. I mean, and from someone who should know better, was like, the biggest staff you've managed is 70. I was like, what are you talking about? And your budget was only like $120 million. I was like, what are you talking about? He was like, well, the Office of Global AIDS Coordinator, 70 people, and its budget's $100 million. I was like, I mean, it was just a joke. I was like, I manage $6.5 billion, including a third of your budget. And I had to oversee the whole thing. So it's like being the CEO with divisions. I mean, it's not, yes, no, I don't directly manage the division. I manage the company. I mean, but in this case, at the time, it was 750 people in one building. I mean, if you can't fix that, you really are not a manager. Tried fixing 5,000, 7,000 people across countries, because they'd have no country offices, right? So it was so much easier than PEPFAR. I was like, oh, it's gonna be so much more difficult. All the countries, I'm like, try being, my board was 700 people. I mean, it actually was much easier, in part because of my PEPFAR experience. It was also easier because it's a much easier institution to manage. The board's a chaos, but boards don't run organizations.
How did you experience, working with PEPFAR from this position, like aligning goals?
So that was a lot easier, as I mentioned, because Deb and I had worked together very closely during the early days of PEPFAR. Well, as long as I was at PEPFAR. In fact, I pushed her to get more engaged and move from DoD to CDC. We'd been trying, and because of the things I'd already tried to do as coordinator, I mean, it was clear that we had to come together country by country and plan together, if for no other purpose than to make the lives of the ministers and the countries easier. But it was just a no-brainer. So we each put in different structures to make that happen. Country teams started working with each other. COPs were, our country team, Global Fund country teams were present at COP reviews for each country. But we also had the country teams work together. So when the Global Fund was developing its country plan, the CCM, it had to work with the PEPFAR team so it was a coherent whole. Never was truly a coherent whole, but we got as close as we could. We started working through, who should procure, let's stop doing the same thing in the same countries. Let's try to separate a little bit. And, there was a move which I resisted, which has become it now is very much to make Global Fund the procurer and PEPFAR do everything else. I always thought that was a mistake. It's going to prove to be a bigger mistake, I'm afraid. It was as good as it could get in terms of the institutions working together. And there was no more fighting over budgets and all that stuff that used to happen.
I imagine, given both your position with Global Fund and your interests, you followed the subsequent reauthorizations of PEPFAR?
Yeah. I mean, calling them reauthorizations to me I'm like, that's not a reauthorization.
It was not the fight you experienced.
2008 was the last reauthorization. Every other one's been 3 pages where you change dates and numbers, and there's a good reason, which is great. That's what should happen, right? You create a stronger program that you can do that. Unfortunately, the sustainability piece got lost because of that, except for this last one. But otherwise, it was a pro forma thing. I mean, it was I don't want to underplay the fact that the subsequent coordinators had to do work, but really, once 2008 was done, these were very minor things. There were little skirmishes on the side, but nothing. I mean, one day of the 2008 reauthorization would consume the entirety of the debate that happened in the subsequent reauthorizations until the last one.
Yeah, and that last one was unlike all of the previous.
Yeah, and co-opted by abortion, just like the defense bill and lots of other. It's absurd. It's absurd.
Yeah. Okay, I am conscious of our time, and so I'm trying to skip through some of these so that we don't take your entire day. And so I'm going to try to ask some like reflection wrap-up questions because you've been very generous with your time. So when you reflect back on your time working with PEPFAR, what are you most proud of, and what are, I think I could answer this based on our conversations, but what are some things you might have changed or wish had been done better?
Yeah, I as I think I mentioned, I was brought up in the Catholic Church. Pride is not something I have, so there's nothing I'm proud of. It was an honor to be part of it. I was doing lab work, and I loved it. It was a great life, but and I ended up helping create and run these things. What a gift! Just an honor to get to know the people I've gotten to know in the U.S. government, all across it, in the private sector, in the community sector in the United States, but globally. The most humbling things in the world are to go to an African village. The most humbling things that we think matter and are necessary to give life meaning, you learn pretty quickly, or we don't know what we're talking about, by going to a village. There they understand what life is and what matters and where meaning. Doesn't mean they don't have problems, but they certainly do. But you learn a lot, and it's very humbling. And it's very humbling to listen to the people and the creativity and the innovation. Everyone parades around about PEPFAR, Global Fund, whatever. All the innovation came in the field. Figuring out how to get drugs to people, those early meetings when community by community they met to decide who would get antiretroviral therapy, or when there are only 4 or 5 people who could get it. Figuring out how to support the systems and the clinics, the community healthcare workers, figuring out how to get products, figuring out how to distribute, the innovations in who could prescribe drugs, how they would prescribe them, the innovations in prevention and getting message. The innovations that occurred at the delivery level were humbling, which infuriates me when I talk to all these INGOs, international organizations, and even the implementing organizations who run those programs. They don't run anything, and the people who run them for them are all Africans, and the technical assistance, while it was necessary in the first couple of years, is now a burden, and actually is 99.999% of the time not only useless, counterproductive. So the greatest gifts are learning from these extraordinary people what life means, and what caring about your community means, and what innovation can happen if you just get your freaking hands off of them and let people go and support them, serve them. So that was all of that. And I would say too, the deep learning on the difference between a public caricature of a person and a person, especially leaders. I've already talked to you about W, but it goes the other way. There are public caricatures that are carefully curated of people who are compassionate and who are the biggest jerks on the planet, who only care about themselves. Life lessons, I think, have been really meaningful, and also how fragile gains are. If you're not careful and if you don't plan well, and that is where the learnings would come from. What we have not done is carried forward what was always the vision of full sustainability. And that didn't mean leaving. It didn't mean disengaging. It meant engaging in a new creative way, an evolution. We're still engaging in the same way we did 20 years ago. That's embarrassing. That's wrong. That's just a total lack of imagination and a total lack of understanding of what's needed for the moment. Why would you still be doing the same thing 25 years later? And that's not, it's harmful to the countries. That means we haven't been listening to the countries. It's back to the first thing. And so I maybe we could have been, I'm sure we could have been more aggressive on transition planning on those things. There are reasons for it not, but there are always reasons for it. We did pretty good things. I mean, the track 1 transitions, the building of the compacts, getting into the law, but obviously it wasn't enough. The other thing is the data systems. And I get in trouble when I talk about this, and people are like, oh, you're undermining the whole program. No, for the US government, and this is just blaringly obvious now. First of all, the US government alone for PEPFAR is spending an obscene amount of money on data systems for our use. And the countries didn't realize that all their health data were controlled by US government contractors. So when we decided to shut them down, they don't know where most of their health system was doing a lot of things. And it's also obscenely expensive for pretty poor data, where there are such better systems out there that the countries could actually own. I mean, it's just an example of the bigger picture. But if you build data systems in the way that they got built, then you think you control everything. And you can actually make bad decisions, and you're captured by the data that you have rather than using the data that you've captured to make a difference and to shift. And instead, I think we've become captured by the data themselves, and has led to some pretty difficult and bad decision makings. And we laid the groundwork for that. And we should have put more checks and balances in and made it clear why the data were being built the way they were being built, and how important it was to transition that to local environments with an agreement that, we're funding it, we need access to it because we have to keep getting funding for it, but it should have been done in a dramatically different way. And I think the way we set the systems probably set a standard that unfortunately led to the unintended consequences that we got to. Pooled procurement should have been shifted to Africa a long time ago. There are so many things that we could have and should have done or signaled better. And oh God, there are so many ways. Did we compromise too much on something? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, probably. Didn't seem like it at the time, but
millions of people are alive.
But I don't think I have any regrets. But I do feel like we could have done a lot of things better. And to be honest, if you ever think you couldn't have, you shouldn't have done the job to begin with.
How has this shaped, right? So you now teach at Georgetown, and
not often.
Not often.
I travel too
much. Okay, well,
I do guest lectures.
So you lecture occasionally at Georgetown, and are the co-founder of the Center for Global Health Practice and Impact. Will you talk about how PEPFAR has influenced the work that you do with the center?
Well, PEPFAR and the Global Fund, and it was co-founded with Dave Bazira, came from the University of Maryland. He was actually a PEPFAR implementer from the beginning, a remarkable guy, and he had built a remarkable team of almost entirely Africans. So a little bit like PEPFAR and the Global Fund, I've mostly stepped back from that because Dave has the same And the African team, because they're African, have the same vision of this radically needs to change, and it's not about us, it's about them. So the whole thing is about supporting countries, and especially now, to own, be sovereign, have their systems, own them, run them, be the innovators, be the creators. So we shift everything. Everything that we've talked about is the inherent, and it's part of the mission of the university, which is why I'm still a Catholic, because I was raised by the Jesuits. Service to others is all that matters. And so the mission of the university, which is very much owned by even though there aren't many Jesuits left, that ethos is very much there. The president, unfortunately, had a massive stroke, is as much a layman as much a Jesuit as any Jesuit. That ethos of service, that ethos of it's not about us, it's about them, we're servants, is very much part of the university. And Deus and the African team, that's what they live for. I was just with the Buja team in Nigeria, and it's just extraordinary what they're doing. And they're really setting the pace for the future, focused on that. What does that reset look like? What does that new engagement look like? Which is so much more exciting than aid, which Africans hate too. I hate that word, right. Aid. I mean, no African needs aid. They need support service, maybe. And they need to tell us what they want and need, and a relationship, a respectful relationship between people, and what does that look like? And that's exciting, and that's a future, especially because that's where 1 in 4 people are going to be, and 1 in 3 between 15 and 34. That's where the innovation will come from. That's where the creativity will come from. That's where the future technology. That's where the breakthroughs are going to come from. Wouldn't it be fun and exciting to be part of that instead of an aid system?
Okay, so we've alluded to this a little bit, but recently the future of PEPFAR, even in terms of making a sustainable transition, are in question. What would be the impact if U.S. support for PEPFAR ends without some of that transition planning?
It's not clear to me that there won't be transition planning. So, the beginning was a little bit rough, and I probably would have done it differently. But as I said, the diagnosis is correct. But you don't want to kill the patient on the way. And I think there are people now in place who fully understand that and are working hard at it in the executive branch, definitely also in the legislative branch, as you can tell from the House Appropriations Bill. And it's not that there shouldn't be a transition. It's what does that transition look like? And not just transitioning from external financing and disengagement, but what does that new engagement look like? What does the reset look like? And because of the self-preservation of large organizations, I think most countries within a year could take a 25 to 50% cut without feeling it. But they need at least a year to plan for. And those are bigger countries. There are countries where that's not the case. But there are so many above service costs that are unnecessary. So many costs to data systems that are bloated, US-centered, run and controlled at a cost that is obscenely expensive. There are so many efficiencies. Take the minister of Nigeria. Going from 72 externally funded programs that don't connect with his national plan, putting whatever resource remains into that. And look, I know this is true. We worked very hard at this, and I've had a long relationship with Rwanda and President Kagame and the country. In 1 year, they took a 50% cut because PEPFAR and the Global Fund were both simultaneously reducing because they'd done such a great job. Now, and people keep saying Rwanda's Rwanda. It drives me nuts. No, there are unique things, but there are a lot of things that are the same, especially now because systems built. But why could they do that? Because we did at the Global Fund. We said, look, we're going to change from what we had before. All these international partners. You're going to give the government the money, this amount. It's a lot less than you used to get. Here are your 8 indicators. If you meet those indicators, you get all the money, and you'll get the money as it moves along. If you meet 6, we'll prorate it, we'll work together, or whatever. But you go do what you need to do. They increase their outcomes with 50% less money because they were running it integrated with their system, and they didn't have all the external costs. 50% of the money never makes it to the country to begin with. That doesn't mean that there's no value to that, but it certainly isn't 50%. So there are ways to do this that will not only be getting by, but being where we should have been already. So I'm not, again, the way to do it is not the same, but we needed radical change. And it's an exciting time to be part of this. We can envision a different future.
Okay. Have we missed anything? Hours later.
I don't know. Maybe. I don't know.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for giving us so much of your time and for all of the work that you've done. It's really amazing.
I don't mean,
I know
it's not my work. It really, my job was to make sure there was money for people to get to actually do the work, and to put the enabling environment to allow that. But it's always been them. That's why I love W so much. He'll never take an award. He hates it. When people thank him for, he's like, don't thank me, thank the American people, thank people in Africa. They're the ones who did it all. It's true. It's absolutely true. But thank you, but it's them.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.